Welcome to the stream. We will today be looking at Guru Viking and Leigh Brasington to wrap off our understanding of. I'm going to retake that. We're rounding off. We're not wrapping it off. We're not even rounding it off. We're just refashioning our understanding of dependent origination. We just read Leigh Brasington's book. He's going to give us a little bit more detail, I'm assuming, from this interview with Guru Viking. Guru Viking asked lots of good questions. So anyway, we're doing this, taking a look at this interview and learning a little bit about dependent origination. So should be pretty fun. Let's jump into it.
In this episode, I'm joined by Buddhist meditation teacher Leigh Brasington to discuss his new book, Dependent Origination and Emptiness.
Emptiness.
Leigh lifts the lid on his writing process.
Soda Pie. The name of the book, Soda Pie, Streams of Dependently Arising Processes Interacting. But it's kind of like a vaguely poly-sounding name, and it makes me laugh a little bit. Soda Pie.
Including how he overcame severe writer's block to complete the book that his students have been asking for years, and shares his reasoning for making this book available for free. Leigh reveals why he considers dependent origination to be the heart of the Buddhist teaching, and traces the different interpretations of this doctrine throughout the Buddhist literature. Leigh also draws on the works of Nagarjuna to discuss emptiness, and levels a critique at the teaching of reincarnation, which he calls an immortality project. Leigh explains why he prefers to translate dukkha as the hippie slang word bummer, how he came up with the acronym SODA PI, Streams of Dependently Arising Phenomena Interacting, and offers medium and long-term strategy advice for how to practice this powerful method to achieve the liberation promised in Buddhism. So without further ado, Leigh Brasington. Leigh Brasington, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, Leigh.
Thank you. It's very nice to be back here.
And first of all, let me congratulate you on your recent publication of your latest book, Dependent Origination and Emptiness, with the subtitle Soda Pie.
Right. Thank you. It's actually kind of amazing. I mean, I don't even like to write. Answering emails is a chore. And to now have a second book out, thank you. It's really quite amazing for me.
Your first book, of course, Right Concentration, Mastering the Jhanas, has become a classic, I think, of meditation books, and a classic on, in particular, the art of jhana and states of high concentration. And this latest book, really rather interesting. I think you've written a very interesting book here in a very relatable style.
Very relatable.
I was going through it and I thought, gosh, this is very much Leigh's voice. But beneath that readability, I think there's a lot of very careful thinking, and you survey various perspectives on dependent origination and other topics, and we'll dive into those as we go, as well as giving your view and commentary throughout. But first of all, this book, I didn't pay anything for this book.
It's free.
What's going on? You've released this book for free, amazingly, on your site. What's the story behind that?
Well, when I, sat down to write the book, which was like 5 years ago, almost 6 years ago, it was like, I'll just write another book and I'll get a publisher and, we'll sell the book. When I finished the book, I actually did find a publisher, but it was going to be a year and a half before it ever saw the light of day. And it was like, let's do a preprint. Hey, I mean, I've had a dozen people read it and edit it and give me comments, and this sentence doesn't make any sense, and you misspelled that word, and you need a diacritical here. It's like, let's just do a preprint and do it right now. No, they couldn't do that. Oh, okay. And actually, they were good. They did manage to get it down to 13 months from 18 months for the digital version to go out. And that's all I wanted, as the preprint was just a digital version. So I hadn't signed a contract, but they were like, you need to get these permissions. And I had quotes from other authors, and I started in on that. And the first one I filled out the form and it came back and they wanted more money for the permissions than the publisher was offering us in advance. It was like,
For the one book.
I'd be better off financially giving the book away. That was what crossed my mind. And it was like, wait a second. I still have to deal with, getting the permissions, but, some of the stuff I actually can find enough other translations of the non-sutta material that I can do fair use. And the sutta material, I wouldn't need to get permissions for that if I gave the book away, because everything
Dharma
I'm using
folks.
is on the Sutta Central or Access to Insight
Nice.
websites. So I could give it away for free, which the more I thought about it, it was like, wait, people did these transcripts for free. People read it and edited it for free. I'm using free software. I mean, I wrote the word processor that I wrote it in. I didn't have to buy a word processor or anything. The Buddha put all this information out there for free. I'm doing my research at Sutta Central and Access to Insight. That's all free. It doesn't really seem right to charge money for this. It seems right to give it away for free. I mean, if this is the real Dharma, it should
is.
be freely available.
Mhm.
And I don't need the money because, I was a computer programmer and computers were good to me. So, I can afford to do this and it would be the right thing to do. And so I did.
He did it. And we have a nice book. You can find it on his website. It's very easy to find. Streams of dependently arising processes interacting. Leigh Brasington. You should find it very quickly.
Wonderful, and it's available at leighb.com is your site, isn't it? leighb.com. And of course, I'll put that in the show notes. And it's there in multiple formats, ebook formats and PDFs and various kinds. So it's fabulous. So what you're saying there has some implications in terms of the way in which the Buddhist Dharma is propagated, if you like, in North America and all over the world, actually, or at least in the Western world, as we call it, which is, of course, through books that are sold through publishing houses that run, on money and so on, and teachers, presumably, who charge fees for their retreats and fees for perhaps one-on-one coaching, etc., meditation coaching and so on. And as you know, there's some division there or debate. Should it be free as the Buddha did it, or is it okay to charge? And if so, how much? And so on and so forth. Should it just be donation basis, which is a kind of deferred fee in a way? But anyway, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah. So it would be great if all of the Dharma was free for everyone, everywhere. But also, that's not practical. I'm lucky because as a computer programmer, I made a nice enough money that when I retired, I can go off on retreats. I can teach and, people give me dana at the end of the retreat.
Mhm.
I don't need the $1 a copy I'll get for selling a book because that's what you get if you go with a publisher. And so I'm in a position where I can practically, in a practical sense, give the book away for free. Most Dharma teachers are not in that situation. And because of the way the West is constructed, you need an income or a nest egg or something. And so, it would be great if it could all be given away for free, but it's not really practically possible for most Dharma teachers. The fact that I am in a position where I can do this, that's great. Part of how I am able to do this is that I'm well enough known from teaching retreats where people give me dana at the end and publishing a book on the jhanas that went through the normal channels. And it's doing quite well. So I have enough credibility and I have enough contacts that I can give it away for free. I mean, the book's been out it'll be 2 weeks tonight. And there are 2,000 visits already to the download page.
Wow.
Nice.
So, obviously I have enough contacts to get the word out there. like recording a podcast for Guru Viking, which I'm really happy to do. So if it's possible, then it should be made available for free, but it's not possible in all circumstances.
Not for everybody.
It's just the way Western culture is built. But I'm very, very happy that I'm in a position where I can give this away for free and feel really, really good about it.
And we're happy too.
Yeah, and even in the Dana models, of course, people still need some sort of income. They still need some means in whatever culture it is of feeding and clothing themselves, etc., etc. And whether that's charging a fixed fee or receiving Dana, the spice must flow, to quote Frank Herbert.
Right.
Anyway. But
one of the finest science fiction books ever written.
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, so let's get to the book then. What is, at a broad level, we'll go into some depth in this interview, but at a broad level, bird's eye view, what is dependent origination? How did you become so passionate about it? And what inspired you to write a book on this topic?
Okay, so what is dependent origination? It's a translation of the word paticcasamuppada.
Paticcasamuppada.
And it basically is saying that things arise dependent on other things.
Okay.
It's
easy.
Really, I think, probably best introduced by the phrase idapachayata paticcasamuppada, which of course is a real mouthful.
Idapachayata.
This, that, conditionality, dependent origination. The first part, this, that, conditionality, is a loose translation. But basically what the Buddha was saying is this arises dependent on that. If that does not occur, this does not occur. Dependent origination is not about causes. Dependent origination is about necessary conditions. So it's looking at reality in terms of necessary conditions. Now, necessary conditions would be like, well, for the light to be on, you need to have the light switch turned on. The light switch being turned on is a necessary condition for the light to shine. But it's not a sufficient condition. You still need the power plant pumping out electrons. You need the wires to be intact. And none of those are the cause of the light shining. Those are just necessary conditions. Excited electrons in the filament or the tube or whatever, pumping out photons is why the light shines. Buddha was a genius in that he didn't get locked into why is all this stuff happening? But, okay, we've identified a problem called dukkha, and we need to find a necessary condition or multiple that we can manipulate and turn off those necessary conditions so that dukkha gets turned off. So dependent origination is an examination of how the world is put together with necessary conditions, specifically to find one or more that you can turn off so that dukkha no longer arises. And this is what the Four Noble Truths are about.
So you look through all the necessary conditions to find one or more that you can actually manipulate. Interesting. No need to go to all of the necessary conditions and try to cut them all out. Just find one or two or however many you can. Only one is necessary, really. If you get rid of one necessary condition, then you've got rid of everything downstream of it. So look at the necessary conditions. Don't bother with causes. Causes don't matter. Interesting.
First is the problem, dukkha. And next is dukkha has a necessary condition called craving. And the third, turn off the craving, which is easier said than done. And the fourth noble truth is how to learn to go about turning off the craving. So really what the Buddha was teaching in its broadest sense was dependent origination, because he said, I teach only dukkha and the end of dukkha.
The dukkha and the end of dukkha. If all necessary conditions are met, is there a way for light to remain off? If every necessary condition is met, can a light not work? No? I think if every necessary condition is met, then it should be working. switch on, wiring, electronics, power plant, working light bulb. It seems to make sense that if all the necessary conditions are there, aligned, then whatever thing will be happening is happening. But if any one of the necessary conditions are not there, then it won't be happening. I think.
So it's the doctrine of how to get out of dukkha, the techniques, a description of the necessary conditions upon which dukkha arises, and an exploration of all of that. And it shows up in not only how dukkha arises, but how we process our sensory input and in many other ways. So it's a broad description of what's going on, but it's not a metaphysical description of what's going on. It doesn't explain why the light shines. It just says, you want to turn it off, turn off the light switch.
Right. If you want to turn off the light, look at whatever necessary condition that you can actually manipulate. Right. But you don't need to care about all of the necessary conditions. You don't need to care about whatever a particular cause is. Look at any one necessary condition that you can manipulate and manipulate that one. He hammers on this point about metaphysics. He said this just now, and he talks about it a lot in his book. He wants to make sure that he is not making any metaphysical claims nor ontological claims. For some reason, this is extremely important for him to express. So we want to hear what he's saying is not anything metaphysical, nothing ontological, none of that is a part of what he's saying. It seems he has like a sort of kind of a conventional metaphysical attitude, a typical normal scientific sort of materialist type of mindset. That's kind of where he starts from, and he doesn't really care to change that. It's not necessary to change it. You don't need to. So there you go. Figuratively speaking, how does that relate to dependent origination? Isn't it just another way of looking at causality? Or is metaphor missing the point entirely, since it's more concerned with consciousness or metaphysics? No, this is good. What you're saying is exactly correct, right? All the necessary conditions are necessary conditions, and if you meet all the necessary conditions, then you have, well, I don't know what all the necessary conditions are, but we have a list of some necessary conditions that lead to suffering, and any one of those necessary conditions gone would remove suffering. But if you have all of those, the list of necessary conditions, I don't know if that's sufficient to cause suffering. But it doesn't really matter. You can just not do that. You don't have to worry about whether it's sufficient to have all of them or not. You can just remove one of those necessary conditions. You can have a more fine-grained list of all the necessary conditions that lead to suffering. But it's not necessary, because if you have any necessary condition that you can manipulate, you just deal with that one. But dependent origination since it's not dealing with causality, it doesn't really matter if you have a list of every single necessary condition. You just need any one that is manipulatable. So in this sense, it's more broad than causality. It's not strictly causality. It's slightly more broad than causality. It feels like dependent origination is more concerned with subjective, introspective experience rather than the empiricist observation. Well, it depends on what you mean by empiricist, but it's about suffering. It's all he cares about. It's all Leigh Brasington cares about, and that's all apparently the Buddha cared about, is personal suffering and how you can remove it.
So how did I get interested in it? I had some very good teachers. Ayakema was my first teacher, and she talked about it. The second retreat I did was with Ajahn Buddhadasa, and Santikaro was one of the teachers on that retreat and translated for Ajahn Buddhadasa when he gave his Dharma talk. And at that retreat, they talked about dependent origination. Mm-hmm. I sat with Ruth Dennison very early on. She talked about dependent origination. So I got the idea. Dependent origination is important. I mean,
it's important.
These teachers are all talking about it. I don't quite get it, though. I mean, what's all these 12 links about? So really, for the first 6 years, it was on my radar, but I didn't grok it. Mm-hmm. And then I did a month-long retreat with Ayakema 6 years into practice. And she talked about it more during that retreat. And I began to get a sense of, oh, this is what it's about. And so it was there, not just on my radar, but as actually something to explore. And one of the techniques that she suggested was memorize the 12 links and then get jonically concentrated and then come out and contemplate them. And
Okay.
that was helpful for beginning to get a sense of it. The next year, I sat another month-long retreat with Ayakema, and that was primarily on dependent origination.
So, okay, well, we're getting some tips here for how he early on engaged with it from his teacher, and presumably how we could also engage with it. So, get jonically concentrated, or concentrated a little bit, a lot of bit. Get concentrated, and then contemplate the 12 links. Well, that's pretty easy to do. So we can do that. Potentially.
Took
Of course, you have to memorize the 12 links. Should be fine enough. After reading the book, I think I remember them pretty well.
Nikaya number 15, the great discourse on causation. However, it's really on conditions. And just went through it and talked about it. And that was also very helpful. So now I'm getting teachers that are explaining it and I'm beginning to get a sense of it. When I first started teaching, it was like, okay, I can teach jhanas, but I think I got to say some more stuff. I should say something about dependent origination. That seems important. So I started talking about dependent origination when I started teaching jhanas. And the more I explored it, the more I found, the more interesting it seemed, the more I learned. And then when I retired in 2008, I started spending a lot of time at Insight Meditation Society's Forest Refuge and doing long retreats there and contemplating dependent origination and getting more of a sense of what it was about. Reading suttas on dependent origination, just studying it. And the more I explored, the more I understood and the more I found to explore. And it just seemed, oh yeah, this is the heart of the Dharma.
That's really cool. I like how that can happen sometimes if you get more into any particular topic and you get more fine-grained and more detailed, then you find in the more detail, there are more and more details to clarify, and there's more and more to see the farther you go. It's really cool.
The Buddha is quoted as saying, one who sees dependent origination sees the Dhamma. One who sees the Dhamma sees dependent origination. And if that's the case, then yeah, I should just keep looking at this. And if it's funny, I wanted to know why things are like they are. Why is it like this? That was really my question on the spiritual path. It wasn't about how can I get out of dukkha. I mean, when I started, I didn't even know the word dukkha. And the Buddha never promised that. He just said he was going to explain dukkha and how to get out of that. But by exploring dependent origination, I actually did get the answer to why. And the answer is, it's because everything arises dependent on other things. Nothing stands alone. And this interrelatedness, interconnectedness, that's why it's this huge net. I mean, the net of Indra is a really good simile. That's what we're enmeshed in. And the more I explored that idea, the deeper my understanding of reality began to feel like was, I'm getting a sense of this. So yeah, it was just, as I've said, the richest vein I've mined in all of the Dharma.
And I'm curious what inspired you to write a book on it, on this particular topic. Like I said before, your book, Right Concentration, Mastering the Jhanas, has become a real classic of the genre. So I'm curious then, Why this topic for your book?
Mostly it was because people kept asking me to write a book on it. My students, they'd say, "You should write a book on that." I was like, "I don't even like to write." "Oh, come on, you did one already. You can do another one." So I had
Tragic.
students who were willing to do transcripts of the Dharma talks I'd given on dependent origination. And so they did. And so once that happened, it was like, okay, I have to write the book.
So he gives like this, you give an unreasonable request, they ask him to write a book and he's like, okay, sure. If you transcribe all of these Dharma talks, I'll write the book. Whatever. Hoping that nobody would ever do that. And of course they do. How cute. How tragic.
So I started it in January of 2016. Went fairly well for 3 chapters. It was like, it was sort of that I had writer's block. I got to the point where I was trying to write about moment-to-moment dependent origination.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a brilliant book by Buddhadasa on that, Under the Bodhi Tree. And Santikaro took all of Buddhadasa's Dharma talks on dependent origination, put that together into this brilliant book that I highly recommend. You should read that book as well, everybody. And I'm not going to write a chapter on this when there's a book that's just so much better. And that sort of stalled me for a while. Then I got really ill. I mean, quite ill. And I wasn't doing much of anything. But then this pandemic came along, and Isaac Newton invented calculus and explained gravity during the pandemic of 1666. I could at least finish my book. So I did. But it was inspired basically because I was finding it the most useful thing to explore, and people asking me to write a book on it.
Okay.
How did you get past that block? There have been other books written on dependent origination, certainly, and you do cite them and recommend them in the book. You mentioned people like Bhikkhu Buddhadasa, you mentioned even academics like Jay Garfield. How did you get past that? Well, this topic has been discussed elsewhere very, very well, and you laud those other publications. How did you get by that block?
So last winter, I got bronchitis.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really persistent. And it was like, I'm 72 years old. Is this the end? Am I going to die? Well, yes, I'm obviously going to die. But
Sometime.
Is this the end?
Uh-huh.
If I actually have something to say, I better say it.
Yeah.
So every spiritual tradition talks about, keeping death over your shoulder. That's how Carlos Castaneda phrased it. Yeah. Just the recognition that if I had something more I wanted to say, is going to be time to say it.
Okay. So if we're going to die soon, what do we do? What do we say if it's about time for us to say the last thing that we can say? Interesting. That's motivation for a lot of folks. Interesting. We'll have to contemplate that. Think about that.
I had revised the outline of the book during the downtime because I've done a number of day-longs and even weekend retreats on dependent origination, and I kept revising how I presented it and so forth. And the sutta in the Sutta Nipata on quarrels and disputes, that's Sutta Nipata 411, I began to realize that, that was really the original teaching on dependent origination. That's the earliest. It doesn't even use the same words as we find in most of it. And that needs to be pointed out because actually understanding that seems to make a lot more sense than jumping into the 12 links. So I started doing day-longs with that orientation, and people were so appreciative because they finally had something they get their mind around. It was like, yeah, okay, I got to change the outline the book. I got to take chapter 4, and I got to move that back, and I got to take chapter 5 and move it up, so I just kept playing around with it. And then, once it was like, if I have anything to say, now is the time to say it. I mean, Newton was busy during the pandemic. I could at least be a little bit busy here.
A little bit.
I did it.
Well,
Nice.
Good thing that you did. In one of the early chapters of the book, you coined this phrase, dukkha is a bummer. In fact, that's the title of the chapter. And to quote from that, dukkha, bummers happen. The origin of dukkha, bummers arise dependent on craving. The cessation of dukkha, with the cessation of craving comes the cessation of bummers. The path of practice that leads to the cessation of dukkha, the Noble Eightfold Path, leads to the cessation of bummers.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So the usual translation of dukkha is suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Dukkha is this wide. Suffering that's
Right.
only part of what goes on. Yes, the Buddha definitely wanted to get out of suffering. But when you start really exploring what he's talking about any sort of negativity. I mean, we'd all love it if we didn't have any negativity in our lives. That'd be
True,
great,
man.
right? So let's just get rid of all the dukkha.
Get rid of all the bummers, right? No more downers, no more negative Nancys around, of course. Pretty cool.
That also means the unsatisfactoriness. Let's get rid of the unsatisfactoriness. And I think that's a better translation. But, when someone you love dies, it's not just unsatisfactory. That's actual suffering. So unsatisfactoriness is not a satisfactory translation either. And so at some point, and I have no idea when or where, probably in the middle of some Dharma talk, I translated dukkha as bummer.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, that makes a whole lot more sense, because what the Buddha is actually teaching is a way to stop getting bummed out about the negativity.
What does negativity mean to him? I have no idea what it means to him, but he's talking about bummers. He's talking about drags. Anything that's it's like a drag, man. Which is pretty much everything. Everything is dukkha. Almost everything. Lots of things are dukkha. It's a very, very broad term. It means lots of things. And you get rid of it. It's this sort of... That's a drag. I don't know.
There's the sutta on the dart. I believe that's Samyutta 36.6. The reference is correct in the book.
Right. Any displeasant experience, unpleasant experience, displeasant, yes. However slight, it can be very, very, very slight. It could be even hinted at. It doesn't even need to be explicit. So it can be slight or hinted. Yeah, we can call it something like that. Any negative, any displeasant, unpleasant experience, no matter how slight. Mm-hmm.
So if my mind is good, I got it right. He says, a worldling gets hit by a dart, and then they get upset and beat their breast and cry out and lamentate, and that's a second dart. An enlightened one gets hit by a dart and doesn't get upset and cry out and doesn't get hit by the second dart. So clearly what the Buddha is saying is what we can learn to do to overcome dukkha is to change our reactions.
So, okay, that's a easy way of doing it. He said in the book, he kind of had a little bit of a looseness with his language, because he said it's our reaction to dukkha, which is a problem, because we're using dukkha in two different ways here. In the same way, this guy, Buddha, gave a bit of a analogy here about darts. So you get hit by a dart, and then you cry about getting hit by the dart, and that's the second dart that you get hit by, the crying. But you could just get hit by the dart and then not add to the pain, not add to the suffering, not add to the drags, the bummers, the dukkha, not have another reaction where you cry more and get hit by more darts. So the pain is like, whatever, that's one dart, and you don't need to add to it by having negative reactions. In other words, to affirm with positivity every state one finds oneself in. Yes, but not positivity either. Because clinging on to positivity or wanting positivity is also dukkha. It's also a drag. To want something, to crave something, to desire something to be there when it isn't there. So, but sort of, I mean, that's better. Affirming things with positivity is definitely better than what most people do. So, on the way.
It says old age, sickness, death, pain, sorrow, grief, lamentation, and despair, not getting what you want, getting what you don't want, having to associate with the ones you don't want to associate with. All these are dukkha.
Dukkha.
Okay, so the Buddha overcame dukkha, but he got old, sick, and died. Right? So clearly it doesn't mean you're not going to get old, sick, and die.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly is going on here? Well, it's clear from that sutta, the dart, that it's about your reaction to the negativities of life. And suffering is not a good translation to point to that. Unsatisfactoriness, not a good translation to point to that. But bummer is, because a bummer is something that bums you out.
Mm-hmm.
I went to the beach and I lost my sunglasses. Well, don't get all bummed out, man. It was only sunglasses. All right. So it's don't have a negative reaction. Don't add to the problem with your reaction. Mm-hmm. If there's a problem, deal with the problem. And I think that's what the Buddha's teaching. I read an interesting article, which I wish I had saved since I've referenced it literally probably more than 100 times, on the New Scientist website. And it said that 80% of our mental activity arises due to mental activity. Only 20% comes in through the senses. And so
what? 80% of your mental activity is caused or due to mental activity. What? Wow. 20% is due to the senses. I'd be very interested to figure out how they determine that. What is the process for figuring out the cause of particular mental activity and figuring if it's caused by other mental activity or caused by sensory input? Well, that's a fascinating statistic. Fascinating.
Oh, taking this to dukkha, 80% of the dukkha arises from our mental activity. Only 20% of the dukkha arises through our five senses. So yeah, what we're after is to stop getting bummed out. Things are going to go wrong. Entropy always wins. Things break down. Your new car doesn't smell like new car anymore, and it's got dings and dents, and you have to take it in to be serviced, unless, of course, you have an electric. But even then, you got to rotate the tires. I mean, entropy is always going to win. So we're always going to have to deal with the unsatisfactory nature of reality.
Bummer.
How can we deal with it skillfully? And so that's what the Buddha's teaching. Mm-hmm. And it's about not getting bummed out. So that's why I prefer that translation. But I don't translate it as bummer when I'm talking about it or in the book. I leave it untranslated because people need to know what the word really means.
Okay.
Yeah, in that chapter, you go through various other attempts, other translations that are often used, and you point out that they're either too serious, they're too dramatic, like suffering, for example. In small inconveniences is a little dramatic, perhaps.
Yeah, I'm a little hungry. I want to get some junk food. That's suffering. Well, that's a little strong, perhaps.
Or too trivial.
Too trivial. My best friend just, let's say you have family members who pass away. Oh, that's unsatisfactory. Well, that's a little trivial. You can't say something like that.
As you mentioned, unsatisfactoriness. Mm-hmm. Well, some things are really not very nice that happen, and to say unsatisfactory, well, yes, we can say that's technically right, but it doesn't quite capture it. And I was looking up.
Feels a little weird to say that. Got to be bummed out in order to get less bummed out. True. And part of the stream of dependently arising phenomena. I don't know if we're going to get directly into it, but it starts with ignorance. It leads through a path to get to suffering, dukkha, and then it goes up to freedom. So we're on a path to freedom, presumably, and on that path to freedom, we have to start with somewhere along the way being bummed out, meaning that being bummed out is a necessary part of the path of getting towards freedom. You got to be bummed out in order to not be bummed out.
The origin of the word bummer, that this sort of slang word, because of course it has different connotations in different parts of the world. And I was looking up the North American usage, and apparently, I expect it comes from the German word they think Bummler, which means
I never knew
one who bummels, just to loaf or stroll about, and it came to mean a loafer or a vagrant in North American parlance, like a bum, that sort of thing. Apparently that's how it went. And it reminded me, and I thought this is kind of funny that you would choose that, because it reminded me of often it said, Korwarakam, the wandering in samsara, as it's often said. I thought,
interesting. Wandering in samsara. But then he says a loaf or a bum. And I'm wondering, are bums and loafs always bummed out? I'm not sure about that. That's interesting.
To myself, goodness, are you referencing the that dimension also? If not, I think that's an unintentional score.
Yes.
It's definitely an unintentional score, because I was not referencing that. I mean, I was a hippie, right? Hippie. And bummer was just part of hippie slang.
Yeah.
I have to be careful when I teach in non-English speaking countries, or even non-North American countries, because they don't have the word bummer, and it doesn't work. But it works great for people of my generation who had a hippie background. They really get what's being talked about.
All the boomer hippies understand. I get it too, man. I get it. I'm not one of the squares. All right, I get it. Boomlin is a pleasant experience, though, walking around slowly with nothing to do and looking at stuff around you, right? That's what I was thinking about, like a bum. Like, you're just bumming around. It sounds like a fun thing, or it sounds pleasant. And if we think about like Buddhist monks, sometimes you can think of them as being very aloof, and they have kind of not very many responsibilities, and it kind of seems like a pleasant sort of thing. So it's kind of a weird expanding the definition here into a weird area where it seems more positive. So I'm not sure. Boomlin is pleasant, though. Interesting. So a bummer's pleasant? Well, in some cases. Well, more to contemplate, the rounding off of the definition and expanding it to mean the exact opposite of what it should be meaning.
The fact that I knew that it originated from bum, but I didn't get the wandering about part or anything else. But that's great. I should add a footnote to the book. That's one thing about publishing a book on your own. If you want to come out with a second edition just because you added another footnote, I don't see any rules against that, though I'm not likely to do so.
You mentioned that your way in was the sutta on the discourse of quarrels and disputes. That was that was one of the ways in through your writing block, and you actually lay out in the book the evolution or the different ways in which this idea of dependent origination is presented. And you point out that most often, whenever this is taught, it's taught as, here are the 12 links of dependent origination. That's the teaching. But you've traced how that theme or principle appears in other forms with different links, or even in a more abstract sort of a form without using links specifically. I'm wondering, you've also pointed out, drawing on Joanna Juravic's work, you speculate that maybe the 12 links formulation might actually be a somewhat later formulation, influenced maybe by Vedic doctrine. Quite interesting. So I'm wondering if you could say something about the variety and development of this particular doctrine through the suttas, and perhaps even beyond, and maybe also give a little bit more details about your speculation about the Vedic influence.
Well, before we get into that, we were talking a little bit earlier about whether, well, we didn't say specifically, but we have the 12 links of dependent origination. And the question is, if we have all of, let's say, the 11 links before suffering, does it mean that necessarily suffering will arise? Well, I don't think so, because the 12 links is not a comprehensive list of all of the necessary conditions. It's not sufficient. It doesn't seem to me to be fully comprehensive. It's just some of the important things and some of the things that are easily manipulatable, and that are, well, they're necessary conditions, so they'll be universal also, which is pretty cool. But there are other lists, many other types of lists and other formulations and other ways to build up and get to suffering. So that's kind of important, that the list of dependent origination is not one set list that is fully comprehensive. It's what we really want to understand is the principle that there are lists that may lead to suffering, and they may be different.
Right. So when you read about dependent origination in the suttas, you find it presented in many different ways. Four Noble Truths, Ayakema said, Four Noble Truths are dependent origination in Telegram style. I would say in Twitter style. Okay, just a summary of the highlights. The first one, you get born, you're going to experience dukkha, right? That's in the 12 links, that's birth and dukkha, right? Dukkha arises dependent on craving. Okay, that's, link number 7 and 12, or whatever the numbers are. So you find it simplified sometimes to just, 2 items that are linked together. You find it with 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I mean, you pick a number between 1 and 12, and between 2 and 12, and you can probably find dependent origination teaching with links of that number. The most common, as you say, is the 12 links, but I suspect that's the latest recension, that it started out earlier. And in the Quarrels and Disputes Sutta, there are actually 7. I initially talk about 6 because the shift to the 7th one, we only get to that in the last chapter because it goes in an unexpected direction.
All because of breeding, all because of ignorance. Breeding is way down the line. Ignorance is the beginning.
But the 6 makes so much sense. We've got a problem with dukkha, and it arises because of craving and clinging, which arises because of, the pleasant, unpleasant experiences we have, vedana, which of course arise because of sense contacts. And sense contacts, that's part of namarupa. Having a mind and body is usually how it's translated in dependent origination. And this makes sense. This makes a lot more sense than 12 links and you get born right before you die. Wait a second. That doesn't make any sense at all. So
a reminder of the 12 links of dependent origination. We don't have to go through all 12 of them, but the last 2 are birth and then death. Which is strange. It starts with ignorance, and then formations and consciousness and senses and bodies and blah, blah, blah. And then it goes all the way up into birth and then death, the last 2. So it's like, it's a little bit counterintuitive if we think of birth in the normal sense of birth, and we think of death in the normal sense of death. It's kind of strange to think that you start with ignorance. And then you come with formations, whatever that means, and then consciousness, and then your senses, and then the body, and however it goes up. It's a very strange sort of way of thinking about it if you're not used to whatever worldview the Buddhists were looking at early on, or whatever you'd be fully entrenched in when you develop a Buddhist worldview. So it's kind of better to start with suffering, and that's built on by craving, and that's built on by sense contact, and your feelings and the pleasant and unpleasant feelings of your senses. It makes a little bit more sense intuitively, or sort of based on our typical native worldview.
exploring all the ways it's presented and trying to get the commonality and trying to get
Having a bad time in life right now. Oh no, a magic turtle. Oh, sorry to hear that. Well, all the dukkha happening. Hopefully, we can learn how to engage with the bad parts of life skillfully. But it's unfortunate that you're going through that. Sorry to hear that, man.
what it's really pointing at was how I got deeper into my understanding of it. Uh, I had I had started somewhat in the middle with the 9-link version that's given in Digha Nikaya number 15. And that one, as I later discovered, is probably an early collection of links with a later commentary laid on top of it. The sutta comes from the land of the Kurus. The land of the Kurus is the area over near Delhi. And it's interesting, there's no suttas given between Delhi and Savatthi. And usually, I mean, the Buddha is traveling along and he's
Samadhi. Is it possible that breeding is a result of ignorance? Is it possible that enlightenment is antinatalism? Interesting. For example, I have mental disabilities that I do not seem to have control over, and there's more to it. Enlightenment, antinatalism. I do not ever recall having a bad day before I was forced to exist. Sure, it seems to have been an unnecessary risk, but always... anyways, I'm being selfish. Oh, shut up. Oh, no worries. We can talk. Would enlightenment lead to antinatalism? I feel like that's a little bit of a strange position. If somebody's enlightened, well, I'm not sure if by the typical sort of Buddhist way of thinking of enlightenment, if somebody becomes enlightened, it'd be weird that they still had a very normal type of materialistic mindset of believing or thinking, I'm not sure what word to use, believing that a conscious experience is only based on brains that have been born physically, like through, women, human beings giving birth to babies and having that experience. I feel like an enlightened person may not be strongly attached to that particular perspective, in which case they would not be particularly attached to not doing that. So they wouldn't be solely thinking about antinatalism, because that wouldn't be the answer. But I don't know, that's just a thought. I guess we have to become enlightened and then figure it out if we're still antinatalist or not. Or look at the broad expressions of enlightened folks out there and see how many of them are antinatalist, and if any of them are not antinatalist, then no, enlightenment is not antinatalism. I don't think enlightenment leads you to any particular position. It'd be very strange to me, I think, for somebody to be thinking that antinatalism would lead to less suffering. That's just my opinion, though.
given suttas everywhere, and there's this big gap. So my theory is that the Dhamma spread to the land of the Kurus, and the 9 links went there, and they composed this sutta along with some other important ones like the Satipatthana Sutta. And they showed up at the Second Council, which was 60 to 100 years after the Buddha, and they had some suttas that thus they had heard, and they were accepted into the canon. My thesis is that probably less than half of what we have as suttas in the Pali Canon were actually given by the Buddha, that most of it was composed later. Whether that's 55% or 85%, I mean, we have no idea, but I think a lot of it was composed later. And so I sat down once and read all the Kuru Suttas, and you can hear 2 voices. This, I think there's about 7 of them. One of them has a different voice than the others. And it's like, yeah, okay, this material is different from the bulk of the suttas. And so, but it was a good way in to start exploring, in particular, start exploring in the so-called reverse order. Because if you try and go forward, you want to say, how does this cause that? But if you go backwards, you say, oh, this arises dependent on that. Duh, dependent origination.
Duh.
Okay. And so I had that to start with. But as I explored more and more, I began to see a more general sense without the commentarial explanation of what it's about. And by that, I mean the Digha 15 commentaries to what they mean, as well as the Visuddhimagga commentary, which is the Three Lives explanation. And so it was just a matter of sort of starting in the middle and exploring out, looking at the 12 links, trying to make sense of them in terms of that, still having trouble with why do you get born right before you die? Unless, of course, it's not talking about physical birth, which is what Ajahn Buddhadasa talks about in his Moment to Moment, that it's the birth of the ego, basically. And so, yeah, just exploring and then finally realizing, oh, this obscure sutta in the Sutta Nipata, the Quarrels and Disputes Sutta, this is the original. This is the one that it starts from. And there actually is another sutta that uses those words in Samyutta 12, and I don't remember the number off the top of my head.
Fascinating. You can just find random suttas that have such great information and, discover, I guess, that it may have been one of the earliest expositions of what dependent origination is, or what it came from. That's pretty cool. Lots of little nuggets of wisdom, or however you want to call that. Lots of nuggets of interesting, helpful information from some of the suttas. Now, there's something that he kind of said. He says it in the book a lot too. He said so-called reverse order. And I don't know if he's going to get into it, but I really like that I like that he says it. He says a lot in the book, so-called reverse order of the dependent origination, the 12 links, or any links, and the so-called forward order. And I don't know what he means by that. I don't quite understand why he's calling it so-called. And I would love to hear him sort of flesh out why he's not comfortable just calling it reverse order or forward order. He has to say so-called, because he doesn't explain that at all. By the way, just piqued my interest, and I'm kind of curious, still thinking about what the heck does he mean by so-called reverse order, and why is it so-called? Why isn't it just reverse order?
So in the appendix 1 in the book, I take a look at all the various recensions of, not all, at a lot of the various recensions. I didn't try and go through and find them all. It was just like, all right, here's a bunch of samples, and you can see that it's not hard and fast to 12. It's whatever the Buddha felt was important at the time.
You're making the point there that going one way through the links might give you a sense of causality, but going the other way can carry more implicitly, more this sense of, more clearly, this sense of dependency.
Right.
Could you, perhaps taking a cluster of the links, give an example of what you mean there, just to tease out this difference that you make? You said in the book that the Buddha was teaching dependencies, not causes, and that's something you brought up a few times.
Many times.
Could you tease that out for us, perhaps with an example?
Okay. So pleasant experiences don't cause dukkha. Right? But dukkha arises dependent on craving, and craving arises dependent on pleasant experiences. Unpleasant experiences, you could say, do cause dukkha, right? But it's not the unpleasant experience that causes the dukkha, it's your reaction to it. It's your craving for the unpleasant experience to go away. And you're clinging to it not being there once it does go away. So birth doesn't cause death. That's links 11 and 12. Being born doesn't cause you to die. No doctor puts on the birth certificate, got born. I mean, on the death certificate, got born.
Sure, yeah.
Right? It's heart disease or stepping in front of a bus or something like that. COVID. So, but in order to die, you have to get born.
Mhm.
right? I mean, that's so obvious.
Yes.
Death arises dependent on there being somebody there to die. And being born, well, that arises dependent on, well, the species that you are a part of having some urge to reproduce. Species that don't have any urge to reproduce don't wind up reproducing, and they're gone. So that's what becoming is about. Becoming is basically that urge to reproduce. The urge to reproduce doesn't
Starting to sound very antinatalist. Honestly, starting to sound like it.
result in birth.
Hmm.
It takes more than that, right? The
It does,
urge
yes.
has to be followed up by some action, right?
Hmm. Some actions.
And there's even more than that going on. There's a lot of dependencies there. But birth is dependent upon the species that you inhabit having an urge to reproduce. So looking at that as
So again, that's clarifying. That's not having the urge to reproduce is not sufficient to have babies being born, but it is necessary in a loose sense. It's necessary, and there are many other necessary things that would lead to something being born. And of course, being born is necessary for dying, but there are other necessary conditions also there for dying.
opposed to trying to look at causes. It just seems to make a lot more sense. Ignorance doesn't cause sankharas. Sankhara is maybe one of the most important words, maybe the most important word to understand in all of the Buddha's teachings after
Sankhara.
dukkha. And it means making together, and it refers to anything that's constructed.
Fabrications.
Okay, all the things of this world that are constructed, whether it's human construction like the boat that you're sitting in, or the house I'm sitting in, or a tree, they're not all arising because of ignorance, right? But when you understand, oh, the conceptualizing boat or house or tree is ignoring the unitive nature of the universe, that the way we chop it up into our concepts is not an accurate reflection of what's going on at the deepest level. Our inability to see time in any other way other than the slice of now and the change at human rates leaves a lot to be explored and see what's going on. This boat that you're sitting in, I can see that it's got a lot of wood. That happens with boats.
Usually.
So you're sitting inside a bunch of dead trees. All right. Do you ever look at your boat and go, oh, wow, look at this forest I'm sitting in?
Mm-hmm.
Can you actually see the birds? Can you see the minerals in the ground? Well, not directly, but that's all there. And that's all part of dependent origination. And you're ignoring that. That's why we have the sankhara called boat, or my sankhara called house, or the tree, or whatever. So it's not about causes, it's about dependencies. And that's really important.
Interesting. So to label anything, to carve out anything as a thing itself would be to ignore all of the factors that are leading towards it, all of the streams of dependently arising phenomena that are interacting that we kind of shape out to call a boat or person or a house or whatever it is that we're looking at and identifying. Interesting. Fascinating way of thinking about that. That's what a formulation is. And if we were, he says, seeing accurately reality, I think he said reality as it accurately is. Maybe he didn't use those exact words. He said accurately. Viewing, I don't know what he said he was viewing, not reality, but accurately viewing something, we would see like the past and the future of it, and we'd see so much that we just see the entire universe interacting with everything else in the universe. Something silly like that. Interesting. We'd see, as he calls this book, we'd see all the streams of dependently arising processes that interact with each other. So that's the level of formation. So if we don't see the thing, if we see the streams of dependently arising processes interacting, then we are not formulating anything. We don't see formations. But when we start when we start to see formations, then, now we have trees, cars, and people and stuff. Interesting. Second most important thing other than dukkha.
Mm-hmm. You talk about consciousness. And one of the things you write is that mind and body are dependent on consciousness, and the senses are dependent upon there being a mind and body for them to be embedded in. This is of course, from a wider discussion here that you're making. You also say, if you have a mind and a body and you're not conscious, and it stays that way, it's a pretty serious condition. I'm quoting you here. You're in a coma and you'll wind up dead. You have to come back to consciousness fairly regularly. It's okay for a few hours every night, and in fact, it seems to be a requirement. But consciousness has to be happening on a regular basis. So I'm curious, if consciousness is a necessary condition for mind and body, how can it be that it's okay for a few hours every night? In fact, it seems to be a requirement, you write here.
But we still have a mind and a body.
That consciousness is not occurring.
Yeah.
And also, what's up with that? I still don't quite understand the idea that we're unconscious when we're sleeping. A lot of people say this, and I don't quite get it. We're very responsive. You can still be responsive to the world when you're sleeping. In fact, if anybody makes a sound and you're sleeping, you'll react to that sound by waking up. That doesn't seem unconscious to me, but I get tripped up on this a lot because a lot of people say that sleep is unconsciousness, and it just doesn't make any sense to me. You're definitely conscious. You're still responsive to the world. You're still there. And even you might be dreaming occasionally, which seems to be a very conscious experience. So I don't quite understand what this whole idea of being sleep, referencing unconsciousness, makes more sense with the coma, or makes more sense with anesthetics or whatever. Consciousness to them means awareness of an experience that you can remember. But you can remember, like if somebody were to, do something while you're sleeping, you will wake up and you will remember what happened. If somebody makes a loud sound, you remember the sound. You wake up and you remember the sound. It's not like you forget the sound when you wake up and you weren't conscious of it. You remember the sound. So that seems to indicate that you're conscious. Now, of course, you're not remembering everything, and you're not responding very strongly to everything. You don't need to remember everything. But that same thing happens if you're normally awake. If you're awake and you're walking around, you hear lots of sounds, but you don't respond to every single one of the sounds in some sort of obvious conscious manner. That doesn't mean that you're unconscious. So, I don't know. Like if I'm sitting around daydreaming, it seems to make sense that I'm still conscious, and if somebody says my name, I will look over and talk to them. But I may not be looking out at the world and responsive directly. And the same thing is happening if you're actually asleep. You're just doing something, and then if somebody calls your name, or if somebody makes a sound, or if somebody shakes you, then you respond to it. Okay. It doesn't mean dreaming. Definitely doesn't mean dreaming, yeah. So it means deep sleep. I agree with that. Somebody wakes you up with the sound out of deep sleep. Can you remember what you did for the last 10 minutes? No, probably not. Right? That's what they're pointing to. But you remember the sound. And I mean, if you're just sitting down, let's say if you're just staring at a wall and then somebody makes a sound or calls your name or something, you probably don't remember what happened in the last 10 minutes. Like if you're sitting at a playground, it's a weird way of putting it. If you're sitting at a park and you're looking out at the park and you're listening to the birds and people are walking past and doing whatever, and you're just sitting there, and if somebody comes up to you and says, "Hey, what was happening in the last 10 minutes?" You wouldn't remember. You'd be like, "I don't know, man. I guess exactly what's happening now. People were walking and birds were chirping. I'm not sure what happened." You wouldn't remember. I don't think that indicates unconsciousness. It just means that you weren't paying attention, or you don't remember. Anyway, I mean, it's not a very important point. I don't think it's a very, very important point, but it's something that comes up a lot. A lot of people talk about sleeping as being unconscious, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. If somebody's unconscious, they are like completely unresponsive. But if you're sleeping, you can respond very well. Perhaps sleeping is only meant to people who are reacting in a way that is less than fully aware. Yeah. Reacting out of ignorance rather than reacting from a place of knowledge. Okay, yeah, sure. I don't know, I was spacing out, not paying attention, actually. Does that mean that you were unconscious? A lot of spiritual people use a lot of metaphors that are logical fallacies. So yeah, a lot of the metaphors are kind of stretched sometimes. Or at least they can be stretched if you think about it too much, which is probably what's happening right now. What happened can refer to inside the mind too, just not necessarily external. Yes. And if somebody wakes you up out of deep sleep and they say, what was happening? And you just say nothing. Does that mean you didn't remember it? Or does that mean that actually nothing was happening? Generally, there's not much mental activity when you're in deep sleep. Okay, does that indicate unconsciousness, or does that indicate that nothing was happening? Anyway, all right, not a strong point. Just a curiosity that doesn't quite resonate with me whenever I hear people talk about sleeping being unconscious. It just doesn't make any sense to me. But okay.
So it's not a requirement for mind and body to keep occurring because of, well, we could call it momentum. Right? So you were conscious,
inertia.
You found enough to eat, you found a place that's warm enough so that when your consciousness goes away, you stay alive. You've got the momentum. If you continue to stay unconscious, though, your
thank you,
mind and
Magic
body
Turtle.
is not going to work. You're going to wind up dead. So, yeah, it's not about causes, it's dependencies. So keeping mind and body alive is dependent on you becoming conscious on a regular basis. The senses operating, yeah, that's also dependent on consciousness. If you go to process them, I mean, yeah, when you're asleep, there might be a sound outside that your ears pick up, but you don't become conscious of because it didn't wake you up. But yeah, to process your environment and stay alive, you've got to become conscious.
Interesting.
At least on a regular basis. So again, we're not doing causes, we're doing dependencies.
Thank you. Very interesting. In the book, you write about various different models or way in which this idea of dependent origination has been interpreted. You've actually touched on it briefly already. The 3 lives model, which you've sort of dubbed something of an immortality project. The moment-to-moment model, and you cite Buddhadasa as a proponent of that, and some other models as well, a transcendental dependent origination model, and you even look at ways of thinking about it from the Honeyball Sutra and so on. Sutta, I should say. And also a great part that I enjoyed very much, perhaps because it has pictures, which is a little bit more my sort of level, is the Wheel of Life.
I like the pictures too. That was really cool. We got the Tibetan wheel, and we can see all the pictures, all the links of dependent origination as depicted by the Tibetan tradition.
And I actually have a picture of that here.
Oh, great.
This particular one, which I picked up in a thrift store something like 15 years ago before I knew what it was.
Nice.
And so I got this out, and I followed through this these
the links
of dependent origination. I followed through your explanation. So I thought that was particularly cool because there's this part in the middle, and you actually show excerpts from a Wheel of Life tanka, I suppose it must be, or some sort of artistic depiction, and you describe each of them and how they're represented in pictorial form. Very fascinating indeed. Could you talk a little bit about that 3 lives model first of all, and maybe contrasting it with the moment-to-moment model, and why is it that you're critical of this 3 lives model, and you call it an immortality project?
He's very critical of the 3 lives model. But then he gives the moment-to-moment model and then breaks it into 3 portions, which was very weird to me as I read it. So hopefully that will be much more clarified here.
Right. So a lot of spiritual and religious teachings is to help people fulfill their immortality project. We don't want to die. I mean, again,
Mhm.
that's a necessary condition for staying alive. If you don't care whether you're alive or dead, you quite likely wind up dead before you reproduce. And yeah, that doesn't do very well for preserving your genes.
It's possible to be conscious without being able to respond to external stimuli and be unconscious while being able to respond to external stimuli. Okay. So your responsiveness doesn't matter for consciousness. I think I agree with that. The issue is that when we talk about sleepiness, being sleepy, it seems that the reason why we say that we're unconscious is because of the responsiveness. And that if we like tease that out a little bit, the responsiveness doesn't seem to be important for determining if you're conscious or unconscious. So I agree with that. Consciousness is not necessarily directly linked to responsiveness to external stimuli. But then you'd have to question, how do you determine what's conscious and what's not conscious? In which case, I would start saying some weird stuff, and other people might revert back to talking about responsiveness. So why even bring up consciousness? I'm not sure.
Right. So we all have this urge to stay alive. And it becomes apparent eventually that your body is going to wear out. And so a lot of spiritual and religious traditions are looking for a way so that when your body wears out, you don't really stop existing.
Mm-hmm.
And so they come up with all these immortality projects. Believe, that's a real popular one. Believe what we tell you. Oh, and yeah, give us some money as well. And then you'll have eternal life.
Give us some money.
Or behave really well,
Mm-hmm.
and you'll get to wind up in a good place, whether it be heaven or reborn in a family that has a Mercedes Benz or whatever. So you find that in Buddhism. There was an article that Stephen Batchelor wrote that prompted an article from, let's just say, another teacher that really blasted.
Another teacher.
He calls Stephen both a Nazi and a communist in this article for not teaching reincarnation, basically. And Steve.
What? Did I hear that correctly? Stephen Batchelor is a Nazi and a communist because he didn't teach reincarnation? Man, folks are crazy. Folks are weird. We got some strange ideas. We all do. We got some strange ideas. I like it. It's kind of fun. A Nazi communist because he doesn't teach reincarnation. How cool.
And came back with a really very nice, well thought out response to this article. And it was right after that I looked at Majjhima Nikaya number 38, the Sati, the son of the fisherman sutta, which is also a title of a chapter in the book. And I realized that the author who wrote this stuff had an immortality project. He was trapped in kama tanha. People who have kama tanha have immortality projects. I mean, there's two ways to look at kama tanha: craving for becoming. So craving for becoming in this life. I want to be.
Kama means becoming, I think. Tana means craving. Kama tana. Okay.
Become rich and famous.
Kama tana.
Or I want to become a deva in my next life, or an angel, or born into a family with a Mercedes Benz.
Craving to become.
So this kama tanha I refer to as an immortality project. And people are figuring out all sorts of ways that they're not really going to die. And this is what Sati, the son of the fisherman, had going. His consciousness was going to transmigrate. This is what the Three Lives interpretation of dependent origination is all about. It's a very nice, elaborate immortality project. And the first two links are ignorance and sankharas. Sankhara is interpreted to mean karmic formations, although the word has a much broader meaning. But by narrowing it down, they can make their immortality project work. That's your previous life. Okay, so in your previous life, you were ignorant and you created karma that has resulted in this birth, this life, with this consciousness and this mind and body, which has senses, which are going to get sense contacts, which are going to produce pleasant, unpleasant, neutral feelings. And if you're not careful, you'll wind up doing the craving and clinging. And the clinging is obviously going to be so strong that when you die, you're going to be reborn. And that's the becoming, birth and death of your next life.
He went through all the 12 links, by the way. If you were, I guess we haven't actually just stated all the 12 links in order. He gave them all in order through that explanation. Interesting. Okay.
So that's the 3 lives model. On a scale of 1 to 10.
And I don't even know if he didn't, did he? He broke it up. He said, you'll be becoming, born, and die. That's the next life. Okay. So only in this life you have consciousness, you've got mind and body, you've got your senses contacting something, and you've got pleasant and unpleasant feelings, which may lead to clinging and craving. That's this life. Next life, you'll be becoming, born, and die. Past life, you were ignorant and had karmic formations. And that just keeps going and going, apparently. 3 lives.
10, I give it an absolute 0 for being what the Buddha was teaching. There's not a sutta that I would say is a definitive 3 lives sutta. The one I mentioned, Digha Nikaya 15, is a 2 lives model. Okay, but it's not a 3 lives model. It doesn't have sankharas and ignorance as part of what's given there.
Okay, he really doesn't like this model, apparently. 0 out of 10 of exactly what Buddha was teaching. 0 out of 10. Interesting.
But again, that's, I think, a later interpretation laid on an earlier recension of 9 links of dependent origination. So going back to Sati, the son of the fisherman, the Buddha lays into Sati for misrepresenting his teachings and not understanding what's going on, and then teaches dependent origination. And after a long teaching on dependent origination, he asks, knowing and seeing in this way, would you run back to the past wondering, was I? Was I not? What was I? What did I become? No, venerable sir. Monks, knowing and seeing in this way, would you run to the future wondering, will I be? Won't I be? What will I be? What will I become? No, venerable sir. Monks, knowing and seeing in this way, would you be inwardly perplexed about the present? Am I? Am I not? What am I? What is this being? Where has it come from? What will happen to it? No, venerable sir. Monks, are you saying this just because I'm your teacher? No, venerable sir. Monks, are you saying this from your own experience? Yes, venerable sir. Good, monks. It's good you know this from your own experience. So actually, dependent origination is a way of examining all of reality, including yourself, and not finding anybody there, which is later styled as emptiness. Right? There's just these streams of dependently arising processes interacting. That's all there is. That's what I'm calling soda pie. Right? So far from being an immortality project, it's a non-mortality project to see that this idea of you as a separate piece of the universe is actually an optical delusion. That you are the intersection of a bunch of streams of dependently arising processes.
The Magic Turtle is saying here that the problem with a lot of these spiritual things is that a lot of people are making just random claims, not random claims, but making claims that there's no way to verify it. And I agree with this a lot, because generally the idea of verification that we think about when we think about verification is in a particular structure, scientific sort of verification, a normal way of verifying based on our normal way of interacting with the world. And that's kind of the structure of values that we have built up. And if we want something to be verified, it has to be verified in that way. But the spiritual folks are using a different sort of completely different structure for building up their worldview and investigating their worldview and evaluating their worldview. So it shouldn't actually be anywhere close to related to how normal verification is. The problem is when they start trying to verify it in the way that you think that scientific things should be verified or normal materialist stuff should be verified, it gets ridiculous. And people are trying to say that their experiences are proof of something. And that's just silly. So you can really easily, well, I think on the surface, very easily determine how deeply the structure of somebody's, I'm just thinking about this now. I'm not sure how to say it. But there's a particular structure of investigating and evaluating something. And if the spiritual people are using a materialist or scientific structure for evaluating their spiritual phenomena, and they think that that's a valid way of doing it, well, you can pretty easily understand that they've gone off the rails at some point, because that's not how you do it. If you're verifying your spiritual stuff, if you're justifying your spiritual stuff with a normal sort of proof structure or empiricist structure, it's just not going to work. It's just a complete muddling, misalignment, and corruption of all types of verification systems. It's just all bad, no good at all. So yeah. Now that you see science is more trustworthy, yeah. Arguments against science are something that might be investigated, some surface level. Yeah. I mean, I think there are lots of other ways of investigating the world, but once they start being mixed, that's when you can tell that there's a problem, right? If you have a science person, they're only using scientific justifications for their scientific things, they're doing a good job. But if they start to use emotional justifications for their science, well, you can tell that they probably don't quite understand their science, and they probably don't quite understand their emotions either, because they're being mixed in a way that doesn't seem appropriate. Same with the spiritual folks. If you start doing your spiritual things and you're only dealing with spiritual justifications and verifications, which are going to be very different from scientific things, that's fine. But then when you start to bring in like scientific claims or claims about the natural scientific world and justifications and verifications that would be scientifically related, well, they're just mixing these things that don't need to be mixed. And it kind of displays a misunderstanding of both structures of values. Lots of air quotes around all of those words, structures of values. It just shows a big misunderstanding there. Yeah, kind of unfortunate.
And that's all that's going on. And if you begin to get a sense of the huge amount of connections, the interrelatedness of all this then the immortality project doesn't make any sense at all, because there's nobody there to become immortal. And this is what Samyutta Nikaya 1215, the Kaccayanagotta Sutta, is about, which is where Kaccayanagotta wants to know about right view. And the Buddha says, this world for the most part depends upon a duality, the notion of existence and the notion of non-existence. And he says that Tathagata doesn't teach that. A Tathagata teaches dependent origination.
Tathagata.
So
you've reached the point where I can't trust science or experiences. A long story, but both seem untrustworthy when thought about long enough. I agree with that. Yeah. If you think about either of them and broaden it to other scenarios, you can see that science works really well in a particular circumstance, in particular situations, but when you broaden it, it's not universally trustworthy. The same with experiences, right? Experiences are great in certain scenarios for doing their certain things in their own particular structure, but when you broaden that, it doesn't work. So we shouldn't be trustworthy in a sense that it's universally trusted at all times. Surely there are some particular scenarios in a very limited scope where science is good, limited scenario, particular scope where experiences are good, and that's the way you verify things, and that's fine, but it shouldn't be trusted in some sort of universal sense as your only way of viewing the world or your main way of viewing the world. That just doesn't work.
Immortality projects are looking for something that just isn't there. Your body is going to wear out. your body is going to die, but it's okay. You're not here in the first place. Well, on a relative level, you are. But if you get the bigger picture, the worry about death just evaporates, and you realize, oh, I'm just a cog in the universe. I'm just a piece of the universe that has recognized itself, but not recognized that it's just a piece of the universe.
Mm-hmm. Immortality projects seem based on duality between mind, body, and spirit. Yeah. And we can hear Leigh here talking about how on a relative level you do exist and so on and so forth. And this is him pointing out that there are different, different scopes and different ways of thinking about the world where it's appropriate to think about certain things and you have different structures there. But that structure isn't necessary at all times, right? You don't need to think of yourself as existing and being alive, and if you don't need to do that, then you don't need to think of yourself persisting forever. It's just not a necessary thought process, or not a necessary thing to hold. So you don't do that. And he also talks about, he says it in another way, I can't remember how he says it. He talks about what he talks about earlier about it not being a metaphysical or ontological claims, right? He's again saying that like we don't need to think about this in the scope of metaphysics. You don't need philosophy. We don't need to think about this in the scope of ontology or things really existing and in the philosophical sense. We don't need to be changing our physics understanding of the world. That's a different scope than what we're talking about. That stuff's not really necessary here. I'm talking about something pretty broad and just showing that you don't need so much baggage. You can drop the baggage. And if you do that, then okay. There's no you. There's no being, there's no becoming, there's no immortality, there's no death, there's no suffering. Blah, blah, blah.
You're not the universe, so you're not going to be immortal by deciding that I am the universe. You're just a piece of the universe, but the universe is going to go on whether your piece continues or not. And we know your piece is eventually going to wear out.
I think for people who are familiar with your teaching on this sort of matters, this won't be a shock. Or to people who are familiar with, you've mentioned Stephen Batchelor, his writing on this, Buddhism without reincarnation, this won't be a shock. But I think to many who are perhaps not familiar with that, the idea of Buddhism without reincarnation, it seems, certainly to the layman, one almost naturally follows the other in terms of association. Mm-hmm. I'm curious why you think that is. Of course, reincarnation is taught in Buddhism, certain styles of Buddhism and so on, or sects of Buddhism, etc.
He's throwing out concepts like soul and spirit, but I feel he has a bias towards physical reality. I get that sense too, but I'm not entirely sure about it. It seems like he may just have I'm not sure. The way that I am imagining what's happening in the most sort of broad sort of charitable sense, it seems like he's assuming a typical scientific metaphysics, scientific materialist sort of idea, and then he's deconstructing that, but not bothering to replace it with other ideals and not bothering to clarify that it needs to be deconstructed. He's just saying that if you feel that you have a body and mind and a normal materialist mindset with the brain and all that stuff, well, we know it's going to naturally happen from that perspective, and we can go beyond it. But that's being quite charitable, I think. It could be that he actually does believe in the sort of typical materialist mindset, thinking that the physical reality is physically real and all that stuff. So I'm not entirely sure about that. Well, of course, he's trying to be pretty relatable. So there is a bit of a benefit of not going through the process of completely deconstructing the materialist paradigm and evoking other weird spiritual concepts and talking about consciousness outside of bodies and all that stuff. Because he's trying to be relatable and help normal people. But also, I'm not sure. Maybe he actually believes in the typical materialist paradigm. So I'm not sure. Definitely not one of those esoteric people who astral travels to different dimensions, exactly. Yeah. But but he thinks this universe is fundamental. Yeah, it's hard to parse out. I try to be very charitable, so I would say not necessarily, but I could very easily read it in that sense that he thinks the physical universe is necessary. It'd be interesting if he got pushed on that a little bit. You could hear more about it.
So I'm curious how you think that happened. And also, what do you make of things like the Jakarta tales, for example, that purport to talk about the past lives of the Buddha? What do you make? This one's a bit of a curveball, maybe. What do you make of things like the Tulku system? And what do you make of masters of meditation claiming to be able to read their past lives, or even read your past lives and explain why it is that you've got one leg shorter than the other, or so on? How is it that this idea of reincarnation, which you framed here as an immortality project, has become so prevalent in Buddhism?
I think this is actually a fine test here to see if he's strongly attached to the materialist paradigm or if he's open to other paradigms and just wants to deconstruct them all. Let's hear.
People don't want to die.
People don't want to die.
Looking for a way not to die. That's why it's so prevalent.
That's it.
So the Buddha was born into a culture where reincarnation was what it was about. Everybody had an immortality project. That's what everything was based on. The Buddha was brilliant. He didn't say, look, it's not about reincarnation. It's about quantum mechanics. Let me explain quantum mechanics to you. Nobody would have listened. If he even said, there is no reincarnation. I mean, there were teachers who were saying that. How many can you name off the top of your head? Yeah. I mean, their teaching died out. What the Buddha did was say, yeah, okay, but it won't do you any good because the devas, they too die and they wind up back down here and they still got to practice. You should practice now. Remember, the Buddha's not doing metaphysics. Reincarnation is metaphysics, all right? The Buddha's trying to get people out of dukkha.
Well, I think that makes it seem like he thinks the materialist paradigm is fundamental, right? Because he said that the Buddha, he seems to be suggesting that the Buddha is just talking about reincarnation to match with the typical paradigm of the people at the time, which is what I was thinking that he was doing. This is what I think that Leigh is doing. He's just talking about materialism because that's the paradigm of our time, and he wants to be relatable to those folks. So he's just doing that because of that. But he seemed to suggest that the Buddha could have been talking about, he could have easily just talked about materialism and quantum mechanics and used that as a justification, as if that is necessarily true. Which seems to suggest that Leigh thinks that that is true. Okay, fascinating.
He's trying to get them to practice. And so rather than saying, no, your philosophy is all wrong, over and over again, he talks to someone and he says, you believe this? And they go, yeah. And you believe this? Yeah. So that means you believe this? And they're like, what?
Right. So you see this? Like, this is what I'm ascribing to Leigh, what I would have been, charitably ascribing to Leigh, right? He's just talking to normal people who have a materialist paradigm, and he's like, okay, you believe this, you believe that, this is the materialist paradigm, and that necessarily leads to you suffering and dying. So that's the paradigm we're going to talk from because most people believe that. But it seems like pushed on it, curious. He's not having that perspective for himself. He's thinking that the materialist paradigm is the correct one, and that the Buddha would have talked about that or could have talked about that just as well. Interesting.
Well, it follows, doesn't it? I never thought about that. This was brilliant to lead them to the point where they have to see what they were believing in a new light, and a new light that actually sheds light on overcoming dukkha. So he was brilliant at doing this. Towards the end of Stephen's book, I believe it's Confessions of a Buddhist Atheist, he talks about the fact that in trying to describe the interconnectedness of us all that he experienced on that night of awakening, the vast picture. The best way he could do it was to use the understanding of multiple lives and rebirth and so forth, and express it in a way that people could understand. He was being practical. He wasn't doing metaphysics, which is the point I make in chapter 1 of the book.
Interesting. I'm gonna have to ask this question to clarify, because I'm curious about him. So I'm gonna ask him this question. I don't know how exactly I'm gonna formulate it, but I'm gonna ask. I'm not sure how I'm gonna ask it, but I'm gonna make a note so I can ask it later. But the curiosity is wondering if he would say that materialism is nonsense in the way that he thinks that the Buddha would have thought that reincarnation is nonsense. But he's just using that framework because most people are typically in that framework in our current society. If materialism was true and I was 100% convinced by materialism, I would be very happy to just jump off a building and be done with it forever. But unfortunately, I don't believe death is possible. Interesting. Well, that's very interesting. I wonder if he believes that most people who believe they're ending the cycle of death low-key want to be reincarnated. Oh, probably so. Interesting.
So if you're interpreting what the Buddha said in terms of metaphysics, you're actually missing the point, although a lot of what he says does have metaphysical implications, but that's not the point of why he said it. So yeah, why do people have immortality projects? Because they don't want to die. I mean, think about Christianity without the resurrection. I mean, there's scholars of Christianity saying, that might have been a later addition. But the whole thing is, for some Christians, believe, and that way you go get to live with Jesus when you die. Okay, that's reassuring. It's a crazy world. You're going to experience dukkha along the way, and eventually you're going to die. What are we going to do about this? You can go back into prehistory and think about it. Grandma's dead. What are we going to do? Don't worry, she'll be back, because people notice that, this little kid here looks just like grandma did when she was young. This is grandma. She's come back. We're not going to die. This is what people are after. And so when I come along and say, nope, you're going to die. In fact, you're not even here in the first place. This is not what people want to hear. It's not what people want to hear from Stephen Batchelor. And so people get upset and throw out everything else because we're threatening their immortality project. Basically, if writing this book helps one person deal with their dukkha, then it's a success.
Oh,
I'm not looking
that's
for
cute.
a bestseller. I mean, to write
You can't even sell it.
Origination, expect it to be a bestseller. That's cool.
With a silly name like Soda Pea. No offense. All right, it's a silly name. All right, it's a silly name. But of course, he's not looking for a bestseller. He's not even selling it. It's a nice book and it's free. I think it was pretty helpful. I liked it personally. I don't know if I liked it to the extent of removing all dukkha, as he wishes that one person at least will do. But I enjoyed the book, and hopefully that adds to some of his enjoyment of having written the book. Maybe.
Crazy. I mean, how many people are there in the world that would sit down and read a book on independent origination? A few thousand maybe. Though I have had 2,000 downloads already of the book. So maybe it's more than just a few thousand.
I sincerely doubt that 2,000 people read the full book all the way through. Just want to throw it out there. But certainly maybe 1,000 or so. Maybe half the folks read all of it or will read all of it, maybe. Who knows?
But yeah, it's a risk of my fame to come out and slam people's immortality project, but I'm not in this for fame. One of my friends used to say, yeah, you just want to be rich and famous. And I would go, no, I don't. I just want to be rich. I don't want to be famous. And it turns out I got a little bit of both.
Nice.
What about the Jakarta tales or
Oh,
the
right.
tulku
Great.
system of
Yeah.
people remembering their past lives and so on, or the Buddha even sometimes in the stories
Yeah.
seeing into people's past lives and using that as a way to explain why they're in the situation they're in, etc.
Right. So the Jataka tales are traditional Indian folk tales that have been co-opted into Buddhism and co-opted in such a way that they explain the Buddha's previous lives. That's what makes them real. Hey, the Buddha was once an elephant, a tiger, a rabbit, and did this compassionate thing. And it enabled him to become the Buddha. You should be compassionate.
Mhm.
I mean, the Jataka tales actually spread to Europe, and Aesop's fables, some of them are based on the Jataka tales. You
Oh,
might remember one about the fox and the grapes. The grapes are up high. He's leaping up trying to get them. He can't get them. And he walks away saying, well, they're probably sour anyhow. Well,
oh,
he's just done what the Buddha said, right? Change his mind. It's a silly way to change it,
that's a
but
silly
he's
way to
not
change it.
upset. They're probably,
That's that's super toxic though. Don't do that. What a toxic way of like he wants to get the grapes. He can't get the grapes, so he just insults the grapes. What a toxic way. Well, anyway, this maybe we can frame it in a positive way, but that's super toxic.
they're probably sour anyway, is his way of not shooting himself with the second arrow. So people like stories, and these stories.
Sounds like ill will to me. It's kind of like it's very similar to a type of like incel or red pill, maybe more incel than red pill. A sort of like trying to get the girl, but the girl doesn't like him back, and he says, "Okay, well, she was ugly anyway." Right? That's kind of the toxicity that seems to be displayed in that story of not getting the grapes. It's kind of unfortunate level of toxicity there, but okay, we get the picture. We see it.
Are really good stories, and they're very good teaching tools. So yeah, they got incorporated by interpreting them as the Buddha's previous lives.
Mm-hmm.
The tulkus, I don't think I want to get into that much trouble by trying to explain them,
Okay.
but
Okay.
yeah, it's very interesting. Stephen Batchelor spent time as a Tibetan monk. I would suggest that you interview him and ask him that question. I'm going to go with his answer, whatever he has to say. As for the Buddha talking about people's previous lives, I refer you to Majjhima 68. In that sutta, the Buddha is talking to some monks, senior monks, among them Anuruddha. And he says to them, why do you think I tell the destination of those who have died? And Anuruddha's got it down. He says, Venerable Sir, our teachings are rooted in the Blessed One, come from the Blessed One, have their origin in the Blessed One. Now is the time for the Blessed One to explain this, and the monks will remember it. In other words, if the Buddha asks you a question, don't give your half-baked answer, ask him to explain it. And the Buddha says, I don't tell the destination of those who have died so that people will give me alms food, robes, lodging, will think that I'm wonderful, will buy my books and videotapes. Right. He says, I do it because it increases the faith in the faithful.
Hmm.
Someone hears that old Joe has died, and I say he was an arhat. And they think, oh, Joe was an arhat? Wow, if he could do that, I can do that. And they practice well and become an arhat.
Nice.
And then I say that Sally was a once returner. Sally made it to once returner.
What?
I can practice really hard. Actually, it doesn't have any names, but it goes through all the 4 stages of awakening for all of the 4 elements of the Sangha. 4 stages for the monks, 4 stages for the nuns, the laymen, the lay women, and even for those who haven't arrived at those stages. And it's all to enhance their faith. In other words, people are motivated to do something that's going to be beneficial for them, particularly beneficial in that they're not going to die.
Interesting. See, this comes back to that sort of, I had this, the interpretation of skillful means or upaya. And it sounds like what he thinks the Buddha was doing was just lying to encourage people to practice more, which is interesting to me. I think it's a fine method, you know, if it works, it works, I guess. And if the only goal is to have people practice, then I guess any means necessary from that perspective. But that's just interesting to me. Fascinating. He thinks that the Buddha was just straight up lying just to encourage people to practice more. Fascinating.
We want the Buddha to always tell the absolute truth, right? Okay. The Buddha was trying to get people out of dukkha. And so he presented to them what he thought was going to be helpful. Another sutta, I believe this is Udana 2.1, and this is about the Buddha's half-brother Nanda, or maybe it's stepbrother Nanda.
In which case, our friend Leigh Brasington may also be just lying about his attachment to the typical materialist paradigm. Who knows, man? So many questions.
Was engaged in love with his fiancée. The Buddha shows up and hands Nanda his bowl and walks away. And Nanda follows the Buddha, and next thing you know, he's a monk. But he's not happy being a monk. He wants to go back and, you know, marry his fiancée. And so he goes to the Buddha and says, no, I'm going to disrobe. I'm going back to my fiancée. And the Buddha says, have you heard that I sometimes visit the Deva realms? Yes, Venerable Sir. And the sutta says, come with me. And he takes him to the Deva realms and he shows him the nymphs in the Deva realms.
Oh, okay.
He says, we practice hard. I guarantee you 500 pig-footed nymphs.
Pig-footed nymphs. 500? Buddhism is looking pretty good right now. Okay. Sign me up.
And says, what do you think of these nymphs compared to your fiance? Oh, I prefer the nymphs. And so he goes back and Nanda starts practicing for the sake of nymphs, and the words gets around.
Very good.
Make fun of him. So he goes off in the forest to practice by himself and becomes awakened. And he comes back and he says, yeah, never mind about the nymphs.
Oh, okay.
So,
well.
Okay, I'm going to say that the Buddha didn't take him to the Deva realm. I'm going to say the Buddha put his arm around him and said, bro, have you heard I go to the Deva realm? Well, let me tell you about the nymphs in the Deva realms. And he tells him about it.
So again, he just thinks the Buddha was straight up lying. Just straight up lying about all the hotties in the Deva realms. This is fascinating to me. Okay. Okay.
It says you can have 500 nymphs. Whether they actually went to a Deva realm or not, the Buddha promised his stepbrother 500 nymphs. Well, there's no amount of practice going to get you 500 nymphs. Not any genuine practice.
Interesting.
It's going to get you out of dukkha. Was the Buddha lying, or was he just using skillful means? Yeah, we don't want a Buddha who would ever say anything that wasn't 100% true.
Was he lying, or was it just upaya? You're saying the same word. You're using synonyms here. Skillful means is lying. Benevolent car salesman, true. This is why I would say skillful means is just coercion or lying. Another way of putting it, coercion. Well, you can call it, you can use a Pali word and call it upaya, or you can try to translate it to skillful means, but bro, that's just straight up lying. The same thing they tell people in order to get them to practice Islam. You go boom. Problem is that there's no evidence. Well, I guess the point is that you want people to practice. So from the perspective of Buddhism here, you just want people to meditate, and you tell them, meditate and you'll get a bunch of hotties in the God realms. Well, okay. That's one way to encourage people to meditate. It's interesting to me. That's all I gotta say.
But that doesn't seem to be the picture that we fully get.
Mm-hmm.
At times, he would explain what's going on in terms of what the culture would expect, telling people's destination or why bad things happen to good people or good things happen to bad people. And it was just his way of teaching. That's my take on it. I'm sure you can find people that will come up and say other things.
Of course.
And also, that's my take on why Leigh Brasington talks about materialism in his way. Why it seems like he is a materialist in a sort of typical sense. But I'm going to ask him. I'm going to ask him in the comments here, and maybe we'll see an answer, or maybe we'll have a lot of other people chiming in on whether he's a materialist or whether he's not attached to any particular worldview. I'd be curious to hear. No, shouldn't compare Buddhism to Islam. Well, there are a lot of you can do some research into Buddhism. I guess the amount is a little different, but yeah, any weird belief system can get you to do weird things in the natural world, possibly.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you, Leigh. You also discussed the moment-to-moment model, which you describe as, and I'm quoting you here, probably the deepest and most important way to look at them being the links of dependent origination. And you cite Buddhadasa as and his book as a key influence there. And also it's here that you get into two strategies for using this concept of the 12 links of dependent origination as a means of a practice, actually. Two practice strategies, we could say. A short-term strategy, which is mindfulness of Vedana, and long-term strategy, which is to uproot ignorance itself. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about this moment-to-moment model and these two strategies, and how it is that this idea of dependent origination can shed some light on the self and what implications that might have in terms of freedom from suffering.
Right. So it's easiest to leave off the first two links of the 12 links in the ascending order and just say, okay, you've got a mind and body that's conscious.
Okay.
And it has senses, and they're going to receive sense contacts. And those contacts are going to produce pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral Vedana. Okay, that's happening. It's running on automatic. If you react in a way such that there's craving, I want to get it, and clinging, I've got it and I'm going to keep it. Mm-hmm. It requires the construction of the one who's going to get it. There has to be a getter to get something, or the clinger to cling to it. It's construction of the sense of self, right? And that is the becoming and the birth that happens. And you've given birth to your ego, yourself, however you want to call it. Unfortunately, because this is an illusion, actually a delusion, it's not what's reality, yourself is going to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, and you're going to have to keep rebuilding it. It's not like you can get something and then, you're satisfied forever. Mm-hmm. Whatever it is you got wears out, gets stolen, broken, whatever, eaten, and you got to get some more. And so there's this continual having to create a sense of self that's going on in order to get and to hold on to. Mm-hmm. And the moment-to-moment look is a look at this self-creation, in particular in relation to the craver and the clinger who's doing the craving and clinging. The strategy is to pay attention, second establishment of mindfulness, to Vedana. Get your mindfulness in there at the point of sense contact and the Vedana that arises. And use your mindfulness not to get caught in craving and clinging. If it's something pleasant, enjoy it. If it's something unpleasant, deal with it. But don't get lost in the craving and clinging. That's basically the strategy, moment to moment, for every sensory input. Okay? If you were to ask me which of the four establishments of mindfulness I thought was the most important to practice, I would say second. You got to do the first one first, because that's the foundation. Until you get that one, you're not going to be any good at mindfulness of Vedana. But you're getting your mind in there between the Vedana and the onset of craving and clinging. And there can be a lot that goes on there. The Honeyball Sutta, which you mentioned earlier, which I talk about in the book, gives some of the details of what goes on in there. And that's important to understand as well. But if what goes on gets out of hand and turns into craving and clinging, it's just a setup for dukkha. So on a moment-to-moment, every sensory input basis, you want to be mindful of the Vedana that are being generated and don't get lost in craving and clinging. But the long-term strategy is to uproot the ignorance, the ignoring of the incommunicatable, indivisible, indescribable nature of the universe, the so-called view of ultimate reality. The two truths doctrine doesn't really show up in the suttas. There are hints of it in Digha Nikaya number 9 and a few other places. It shows up apparently in the questions of King Milinda a few hundred years after the Buddha, and then comes full blown with Nagarjuna in his Malayalamaka Karika discussion of emptiness. But we do need to be able to look at the world from a different perspective than the way we usually look at it. From the ultimate perspective, I actually prefer two perspectives rather than two truths. I mean, we got this water glass.
I like it.
Here. Is it concave or convex?
I like that. I like that a lot. He calls it two perspectives. I really like that. There are many more perspectives too, but two perspectives in Buddhism, excuse me, or two, maybe two categories of perspectives that we can talk about, where you have the absolute category of perspectives, which would be a single perspective or non-perspective, and the relative categories of perspectives, which are typical perspectives. I like this. I like this a lot.
Right? Well, if I would put water in it, it better be using the concave, but I could turn it upside down and use it to elevate a candle. And then I would be using the convex. It's both at the same time, but it depends on your perspective as to what you see. So reality depends on the perspective where you're seeing the relative perspective of, yeah, this is my cell phone. It's not your cell phone, right? This is your boat. It's not my boat, etc. So it's a useful perspective. You can't cross the street from the ultimate perspective. You get run down. You look, you see a bus coming. You can't say it's empty. It'll still run you down. So
right. So again, this is that sort of mixing of many different perspectives or different worldviews, right? If you're trying to justify some perspective, let's say relative perspective with absolute perspective, well, this is just a misunderstanding of both, right? If you're walking in front of a car and you're attempting to walk the street, this is all relative things. You see cars, you try to walk across the street, and you try to use some sort of absolute perspective from this Buddhist standpoint, absolute perspective of seeing that everything is empty and yourself is empty and all your intentions are empty and everything, nothing really matters and everything's going to go through everything anyway, to allow you to walk through the street and pass through the cars. That's just a mix of different perspectives, and things are going to go wrong here because you have a misunderstanding of the absolute perspective and a misunderstanding of the relative perspective, and that's not going to end up well. In the same sense, where you have multiple different relative perspectives, you have, let's say, spiritual perspective and a scientific perspective, and you start to justify your spiritual stuff with scientific things, it's not going to mix well. Everything's going to fall apart, be wrong, and bad. So stick with one perspective, or stick with whatever perspective you're at, and whatever structure perspective that you're at. At least that's how I'd say it.
We have to operate from the relative perspective, but as Nagarjuna said, actually not the relative perspective, but the perspective that doesn't fully reveal. So we have to operate from the perspective that does fully reveal, usually called the ultimate perspective, to be able to get free of dukkha. And when we can explore that perspective deeply enough, then we can overcome the ignorance, the ignoring how the world really works. And if we do overcome that ignorance, then we see there is nothing worth craving. There is nothing that can be clung to. The craving and clinging gets uprooted. No more dukkha, because you've removed the necessary conditions for the arrival of dukkha. So it's the uprooting of dukkha that provides the ultimate, the full awakening perspective. The uprooting of ignorance that provides the ultimate full awakening perspective that gets us out of dukkha once and for all. Meanwhile, pay attention to your sensory input and don't get lost in craving and clinging.
I'm curious if mindfulness of Vedana, which is as you presented the book, a short-term strategy, is sufficient to lead to the long-term strategy of uprooting ignorance, or is it necessary to engage a wider range of analysis or different meditational tools?
I suspect that it requires a wider range. I say this not because I've gotten all the way, I still got work to do, but because I've managed to reduce the dukkha further by getting the wider perspective.
Mm-hmm.
The keeping your mindfulness out there at the Vedana thing is a lot of work, and most of the time you're not going to be able to pull it off.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You can get better and better at it, but it's going to be exhausting, and maybe you're going to lose your motivation. It's like, no, I'm just going to go eat that chocolate bar or whatever.
And not be mindful.
If you can get the wider perspective to see that, yeah, there's nothing really there, I think that's going to be required. If we look at transcendental dependent origination, there's a chapter on that as well. We find that, okay, from dukkha, you gain confidence as a path out. And from that confidence arises pamoja, worldly joy, practicing the path and getting some results. You're able to take that into the four jhanas.
Mm-hmm.
And from the coming out of the four jhanas, you have the ability to, it's usually said, knowing and seeing things as they are. I want to say knowing and seeing what's actually happening, because it's more verbs than nouns, right? So knowing and seeing what's actually happening, you can become disenchanted.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So the knowing and seeing what's actually happening is overcoming the ignorance. And then you become disenchanted. You break the spell. We're enchanted by, if we just get another fill in the blank, we'll be happy.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And now we become disenchanted. We break the spell. And then we become, well, it's usually translated dispassionate. Not a particularly helpful translation. The word is viraga. Raga is to color something. The Indian musical raga is to color your mind.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, graffiti is a raga. Okay, so viraga is to not color. So your mind is no longer colored by the things you were enchanted with.
Uh-huh.
You have dispassion. Think of a toy that you had as a kid, a toy that if you lost it, you would be devastated. And now today, where is that toy? You don't even know, right? You've become dispassionate towards that toy. It doesn't have the hooks it had before. So I think that knowing and seeing things as they are, disenchantment, dispassion, is what's required to go all the way. What follows next in dependent origination is liberation. So, and that's going to be the overcoming of ignorance. So I think to get the whole way, you're going to need that.
And for him, just to clarify, because he didn't say it before he did all that, but he said it just then, that all of this is the next part of dependent origination. So you start with ignorance, you go up to dukkha, we talked about that earlier, and then from dukkha you get the faith, and then the jhanas, and so on and so forth, and then dispassion, and disenchantment, dispassion, and freedom, right? So, and then freedom will be the uprooting of ignorance. But you have to start with ignorance. To uproot ignorance, you need to have the dukkha in order to gain your faith, and then overcome dukkha in the end. So it's all dependent on itself in some circular sense, kind of. You uproot it. You need it to uproot it. Interesting enough.
You mentioned Nagarjuna. And actually, some way through the book, you move beyond the suttas to consider Nagarjuna, an author who you're, I suppose, what could we say? You admire him? That's not quite the right word, is it? What would you say?
I admire him, but I also find his writings to be extraordinarily helpful.
Yeah, that's the right way to put it. Yeah, a great influence on you, Nagarjuna, and your appreciation for his writing and thinking comes through in this section. And one of the key points you make there is that dependent origination by the time of Nagarjuna is equated with emptiness, and that has actually several implications. In fact, you write, when you hear teachings on emptiness, what you're hearing is teachings on dependent origination. Can you talk a little bit about that, dependent origination and emptiness? And you, of course, explain this in the book. Can you say a little about how Nagarjuna makes that link and perhaps hint at some of its implications?
Yeah.
Hello.
So
Good
what
evening.
Nagarjuna is doing is looking at various aspects of life. It starts out with movement, with seeing, with a body and its parts, and says things are empty because they arise due to other things. There's a dependency there. Walking, you can't have walking without a walker, but you also can't have a walker without walking. They are both concepts, and each concept is dependent on the other. And so he starts exploring pretty much everything until eventually in chapter 18, he gets to self. And he points out that, yeah, you are not the same as or different from the conditions on which you depend. You're neither forever fused with them nor separated from them. This is the deathless teaching of Buddhas who care for the world. That's Sotapai.
That's Sotapai. Interesting. So this, when we got into the part of Nagarjuna, the book, it seemed more like, as he's saying here, you need a walker in order to walk, and you need walking in order to have a walker, and they both kind of arise dependent on each other. That seemed, we had like a long part, well, not a long part, but we emphasized in the very beginning of his book that dependent origination should not be described as co-dependent origination. It's dependently co-arising, possibly. And here, the structure of this sort of thing, walking needing a walker and walkers needing walking, that the structure of that seems very different from the structure of the links of dependent origination, which seem to be kind of like stacked on top of each other, whereas these kind of come together at the same time. I wonder if there was there isn't any teasing out and the differences between the types of things that dependently arise, and some of them are like dependently arising at the same time, and others, can arise. You can have a foundation of Vedana and not lead to craving or not lead to clinging, for example. But here you can't have a walker and that not lead to walking. They both are depending on each other. So how do we untangle the type of dependent origination where two things are both dependent on each other, walking and walkers, and then, type of dependent origination where they don't necessarily lead to each other. So I'm not sure. Was it Leigh that was like, low powers, yeah, and then immediately proceeded to quote a massive passage from the suttas on the powers? Probably, yeah. He talked about it today. He's kind of like, he's very dismissive of a lot of the claims from that we would consider to be supernatural in any sort. He's pretty dismissive of that stuff. Lol, powers, lol, yeah.
Right.
I gotta ask him a question about it. I'm gonna ask a question after the video.
There, that verse, more than anything else that I ever encountered, led to Sotapai. Just to see that everything, I held up my cell phone, right? It's a cell phone. Well, no, it's plastic and silicon and glass and metal. Oh, and programming and, the silicon, that's sand, and the sand that was produced by rocks being crushed by gravity because they were on the bottom of it. There's so much that goes into this being a cell phone. It's empty of cell phone-ness.
I'm going to ask him a question in the comments. Yes, I'm going to ask him in the comments. I don't have any personal contact with Leigh. I'm just going to ask him in the comments. and maybe that'll ripple to get to him in some way, or maybe not. It's just a curiosity. It's not really a super important question, but I will be asking it.
Right. And someday it's going to break, wear out, whatever, and then it'll get recycled, become, I don't know, an iPod or something. Everything is like that. Everything is back in time, dependent on a whole lot of stuff, and forward in time is eventually going to be recycled into other things. Your boat, as I said, it used to be a bunch of trees, and eventually, maybe it's going to be firewood when the boat finally wears out. We're just the same way. We're just as empty, we're just as dependently originated as everything else in the universe. And so to see that there's no essence to anything, no essence of boatness in your boat, no essence of cell phoneness in my cell phone, no essence of Leigh in me, just streams of dependently arising processes interacting. That's all there is. That's what it means to be empty.
Can we talk about soda pie?
Yeah.
Like I said, I think that's such a cool acronym, and I think, like I said, I think with soda pie you have definitely elevated. It's such a maybe that's a little heretical to say.
Soda pie is definitely not a cool acronym. I don't know what this guy's on. All right, Guru Viking usually on point. I don't know what he's on right now. Soda pie is such a silly acronym. It's so long, first of all, and there's something about it that makes me laugh because it sounds vaguely Pali, or vaguely like, Sanskrit, vaguely sort of ish. And it just makes me laugh. It's so silly.
You are God.
How ridiculous. Hey, thanks for following Benevolent Elephant. Whoa. I'm glad you're part of the community and you finally decided to follow. Hey, welcome.
Say to the to the Buddhists among us, but I think you've elevated its coolness factor, certainly, with soda pie.
New account. You lost all your dank Dow points. Oh, wow. Wait, you have a new account? It looks like the same name. How'd you do that? What'd you do? Did you get banned somewhere? What you been doing in other Twitch streams? Huh?
But dependent origination, that's okay. But Teacher Samapada is pretty cool. But soda pie is like, that's really, really, really excellent. How did you come up with that?
Yeah, so I'm trying to describe what I'm seeing. And so I'm seeing streams of dependently originating phenomena interacting. That was the first. So
it was Benevolent Elephant 108. You got a cleaner name. Why'd you have 108 in the first name? Well, that's interesting. You finished all 108 mantras, so you just Benevolent Elephant. Oh, I see. Oh, that's cool. Fascinating.
Dough pie. But sodo pie. That's kind of weird.
Sodo pie.
Some people say dependent arising instead of dependent originating. I'll just use arising. And then it becomes soda pie. And I don't know if you've seen the back cover of the book.
I haven't.
Yeah. So if you go to my website and you click on the book, Dependent Origination and Emptiness, you'll arrive at the initial page for the book. And it says other formats, paperback. And if you click on paperback and scroll to the bottom, there's a picture of the back cover and the front cover. So if you want to make your own. And if you look carefully at what you see, you can click on that and you'll get a big picture of it. What do you see?
It's a soda with a plate of pie.
Right, exactly. That makes it a mnemonic.
This is so silly.
So it's
this is ridiculous.
Easily rememberable mnemonic, soda pie.
How silly. Okay, now we're looking at soda pies. All right, let me pull it up here. Let's look at the soda pie. This is the book. I think this is the one in book form. No, it isn't. Uh-oh. Right click. PDF. This version is for generating paperback. Paperback? Wait, I clicked that one. Okay, well, I don't see it. I don't see the soda on top of a pie. And I think that's pretty ridiculous anyway, so I guess maybe it's a good thing that we don't see it. Okay. Let's continue.
Okay. And yet, if you plug in the letters, you get dependent origination. Several of my students are referring to the book as Soda Pie. They were asking, when is Soda Pie coming out?
Nice.
Yeah, oh, you got a publisher for Soda Pie. That's
Soda
great.
Pie, yeah.
It's going to be 18 months before Soda Pie comes out. Oh, that's too bad. So they're referring to the book as Soda Pie.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the cover of the book, it says dependent origination and emptiness up at the top. And then it says streams of dependently arising processes interacting with each word one above the other so that the initial letters line up and they're in a different color. So you actually see Soda Pie on the cover. It's kind of a sneaky way to do
Found it.
But since Soda Pie.
Found it. Okay. Soda and pies. It's two streams. See, we have two streams of dependently arising processes, and they are both interacting in this beautiful picture. Soda Pie. Soda Pie sounds like a name for a Zoomer Twitch YouTube streamer. Soda Pie. It does. I mean, it sounds like soda popping, right? That's one of the other streamers, right? Soda pop, popping, soda pop. I remember these sodas. They were always in the bodegas. 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 The heck does that mean? Okay, soda's in the bodegas. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. I wonder if this is like a stock photo or is it him? Well, I guess he's not black and he's not a woman, so I'm guessing it's not him. But maybe this is a white guy. It's just shadow. Oh, that's just shadow. It could be him. Anyway, whatever. Just a silly question. I wonder if it's a stock photo or not.
Well,
Do we not have bodegas in ATL? When you say bodegas, I'm thinking of like Chicago maybe or New York, but I don't think I've ever heard of a bodega in Atlanta. I don't know what the heck a bodega is, honestly. I don't think I've ever heard that be referenced in Atlanta. Maybe he just likes the way the nails look. Don't be judging. Oh yeah, I guess he could be a lady, or I mean, he could be a guy with long purple nails. It's possible, but there's also like a little bit of a boobage going on that is visible. So, I don't think it's him. I don't think so.
no, I sort of got to sneak it in there to begin with. And then when you get to the back cover, there it is. And actually the website for the book itself is sodapie.leigh.com.
Mm-hmm.
But if you click on leigh.com, you can easily get there.
And what you've done with that image is now we can also add this to the Wheel of Life tanker. Not only do we have each of the links represented as you describe them in the book,
But you have all of the links in one.
pictorially, you have now contributed an image that encapsulates the entire, admittedly in a mnemonic form as opposed to symbolic form, the entire doctrine.
Right. That was, it just sort of came out. I started talking about it, when I'm giving a Dharma talk and I'm saying this stuff. And
The 14 links, the soda and the pie being a part of the links.
it just sort of,
Okay.
Sodo Pie comes out, and it was process. It was phenomena to begin with, but it was like, no, it's not phenomena, it's processes.
Mm-hmm.
And then it became streams of dependently arising processes interacting. Of course, I tried to get an E on the end of it. People, and I kept.
So actually pie.
People would say, you need an E on the end.
So if you put pie, if it was an E at the end, I think it would seem a lot less like fake poly. When I hear the word soda pie, I think he's trying to make fake poly. But if you actually put an E at the end of it, well, then it seems like he's making a weird mnemonic, which I feel like both are happening here. It sounds like fake poly. It sounds like a weird mnemonic. I think it's really silly, but apparently a lot of people liked it, so whatever.
And say, okay, give me a good E. Eternally is what most people initially suggested. But I don't know eternally. I can't say eternally. I don't know anything about eternity, right? All I can say is this is what I'm seeing now. Entropically, that's really good, but it's
entropically.
Weird. It's very weird. Other people had other suggestions. None of them actually really worked. So it was like, okay, all right, it'll have to go with the Greek letter pi, even though the picture has edible pie.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, Leigh, this has been so interesting. I should say we've really only scratched. We've actually gone through quite a lot, but we've only really scratched superficially what you're laying out in the book. There's also an extensive discussion on nirvana and different sutric presentations of what nirvana actually means. Well, what does it mean to achieve nirvana or to enter nirvana and these sorts of things? And you describe that and go through these various different comparisons there, which is, I think, also very interesting. You talk at length about Nagarjuna, consciousness, and all sorts of things. So actually, if any of this has whetted the appetite of the listener or viewer, I would strongly suggest go to leighb.com and get a copy of this.
Check out the book. It's free.
You haven't said or haven't talked about that we should talk about.
So one of the important chapters is a chapter on the Honeyball Sutta. And in there, I make the claim that a better translation of the Pali word sanya, which is usually translated as perception, is conceptualization. I found that so helpful. One of the teachers at the Forest Refuge, Annie Nugent, mentioned just offhandedly in a talk on the five aggregates that sometimes sanya is translated as conceptualization. I never heard another word she said after that, because the light bulb went on, and I'm plugging conceptualization into every place I know sanya is in the suttas and going, yeah, it's better. And conceptualization is what we do. So what do you see here?
Flowers.
You see a bird? You see some flowers?
I don't see the bird.
Yeah, no bird, no flowers there, just colored shapes. The bird and flowers are your sanya. You conceptualize that. It's all happening in your mind, that you take the colored shape, the visual input, and you conceptualize what it is. I hold up this and you go, oh yeah, that's a mask. If I held it up, 3 years ago, you go, oh, I don't know what that is. Oh, but now everybody knows you've got the concept down, right? So we operate on concepts. We see the holistic world, but our pea brains are too small to take it all in. So we have to bust it up into pieces that we can manipulate, deal with, digest, chew. And those are bits of sanya, concepts. And those concepts sometimes are accurate reflections of reality, and sometimes they're not. And all of our thoughts and emotions, those are sankharas, making together. We make together bits of sanya to have our thoughts and emotions. So I lost my sunglasses at the beach. I'm all bummed out. Okay, so there's the concept of sunglasses, mine, lost, beach, bummed out. We string them together and we have the thought, right? And can you do the other concept of I'm not bummed out? Maybe whoever found them needs them more than I do. There's another concept to throw in there. Someone finding them, needing them, right? And you overcome the dukkha. So conceptualization is a really, really important thing to understand on the Buddhist path. And the title of the last chapter of the book is Don't Be Fooled by Your Conceptualizing. And that's a really key point. I mean, that's basically where I'm going with this book, is trying to convince people to pay attention to their conceptualizing and not get fooled. The whole thing with the pandemic going on because people don't want to get vaccinated, well, it's their conceptualizations about what's going on, as opposed to, taking a closer look at reality.
How does this book fit in?
Interesting. See, even that, it seems to suggest that he thinks that the reality is the typical materialist scientific paradigm. It's interesting to me. That's what I want to ask. That's what I want to learn about from his perspective. Okay.
With your book on the jhanas, right? Concentration. Let's say a person has read right concentration, they've been practicing that, pursuing the jhanas keenly, they've absorbed the material in that book. How does this book fit in with that? What advice would you have for somebody who's familiar with right concentration and perhaps even is practicing from that point of view to approach this topic of sotapai?
Right. So the way to do it is get your mind jhanically concentrated and then step out of the highest jhana you know, 4, 7, whatever, and start contemplating sotapai. Start contemplating the ideas in the book. Learn the 12 links so you can recite them forwards and backwards. Okay.
Can we recite the 12 links forwards and backwards? I think it's pretty easy, right? You start with ignorance. Let's think about this. Ignorance, formations, consciousness, mind, body, senses, contact, Vedana, clinging, craving, becoming, birth, death. Can I go backwards? Yes. Suffering, birth, becoming, craving, clinging, craving, Vedana, sense contact, senses, so on and so forth, right? Consciousness, mind, body, consciousness, formations, ignorance. Okay, well, we got step 1 here. We know we know it front and back from reading. We know it front and back. Got to get through the jhanas, or any jhana that we know, or any level of concentration, and then contemplate it. Easy enough. And then forget the soda. Okay. Craving, clinging, craving, birth, soda, pi, death. Makes it give us a whole 12 links, 14 links with it nested within itself. 12 links nested within. We can think of it in that way too, I guess. So, okay. Easy steps for us to grasp, I guess. Easy things to remember that and then contemplate after a little bit of concentration. Easy.
It's going to be real helpful.
I don't remember also he gives us a further list, a more expanded list after that. So you get the dukkha, and then you have, or death, however you want to call it. Dukkha, and then faith, and then the foundations of jhana, and then dispassion. I don't remember that step, the links after that. So maybe I can try to remember that too and have all that be a part of the contemplations. Mm-hmm.
Contemplation while you're still sitting in your meditation posture, and continue the contemplation until the bell rings.
Okay.
In general, what you want to do is spend about half of the meditation period getting concentrated, and then half of the meditation period exploring reality. And exploring dependent origination, contemplating it, is a very effective way to understand what the Buddha was talking about. That's what this book is. That's where it came from. I get jhanically concentrated and think about dependent origination. It is legal to think while you're sitting on a little pillow. So if you stay on topic. And yeah, that's where the book comes from, is my contemplations of dependent origination with a jhanically concentrated mind.
Easy.
The Buddha taught Sila Samadhi Panya. That's his teachings in a 3-word nutshell: morality, concentration, wisdom. Basically, clean up your act, learn to concentrate your mind, use your concentrated mind to investigate reality. You got to do the morality thing before you sit down on the cushion. Keep the precepts, right? And then use the jhanas to concentrate your mind. Hopefully my book is somewhat useful for that.
Hopefully.
And once your mind is concentrated, then start examining reality, and hopefully dependent origination and emptiness is a way for you to examine reality that will be fruitful.
Wonderful. Meditation in the Latin sense.
Yeah. Yes.
Meditation.
Leigh, this has been
contemplation. Meditation, meaning contemplation, Latin sense, blah, blah, blah. Latin sense. All right.
Fabulous. Thank you
cool.
for appearing here and discussing your new book, Dependent Origination and Emptiness, subtitle, Sotapai.
Thanks, Leigh.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve. Mr. Guru Viking.
Thanks.
That was fun.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast.
Gracias
For more
a ti.
interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.
GuruViking.com. Wow. Okay. All right. I gotta take a short, minuscule break, but I'll be right back. Hear me. Okay. Hello. Welcome back. So I've got a question to ask for Leigh. I'm not entirely sure how to frame it. He talked a little bit about upaya, or skillful means. And essentially, he was saying that the Buddha was lying to people about reincarnation and other things just because that was their mindset at the time. They were just believing in reincarnation, so he just kind of flexed that to encourage them to practice. He even referenced encouraging one person to practice by talking about nymphs in the god realms. So a bunch of hotties, or 500 of them particularly, 500 hotties, ready for this guy if he meditated well enough. And Leigh thinks that he was just straight up lying to him. And I'm curious if Leigh is doing the same thing when he talks about materialist paradigm. Does he believe it or not? I don't know. I'm curious. It's my curiosity. But beyond that, I really like how he lays out the teachings. I think it's pretty good. Who's this Tsongka? Jay Tsongka? What a load of fakery. Yeah, exactly. What it sounds like. Who is this Jay Songpa? He said something about him also working with Emptiness and whatever else. Emptiness and dependent origination, making them equal. Where do we learn more about this guy? Gelug lineage. Okay. Interesting. Well, who would be broken? Wondering still for Magic Turtle about all the babies we won't be having. I'm not sure. I'm open to the possibilities that life may serve some purpose. I'm also unconvinced that it does serve some purpose. Interesting. At least it appears to me that life is a disease in the mind of God. Not sure how I feel about old primary sources, but this is a classic. Okay, let's take a look at the classic. Okay. Seems like a quick read. In praise of dependent arising. Oh, can I just listen to it?
In praise of dependent arising by Tsongkhapa.
Okay, I could listen to it, but the audio quality. Is he just going to read this? It actually seems longer than I thought. Let's take a look at the first couple stanzas or chapters or paragraphs. I bow to you, the triumphant Buddha. The triumphant, you just call him the triumphant? I bow to the triumphant, who has seen and taught dependent arising, which to see a knower and to speak of an unsurpassable instructor. Well, to see makes you a knower, and to speak of makes you an unsurpassable instructor. What's up with the parentheses? So to see dependent arising makes a person a knower, makes the Buddha, the triumphant, a knower, and to speak of dependent arising makes him an unsurpassable instructor. Unawareness is the root of as much torment as there is in the world. Unawareness is the root of all torment, okay? Thus you spoke of dependent arising, which, if seen, turns that back, the unawareness back. At that time, how could those with intelligence not have comprehended the path of dependent arisings as being the essential point of your teaching? As that is so, how could anyone find as a gateway for praising you, O guardian, anything more wondrous than your statements about dependent arising? Man, I like the sort of praising aspect. I guess it's called in praise of the dependent arising. I like this sort of calling the Buddha triumphant and O guardian and all that. It's kind of cute, flowery language. Whatever depends on conditions is devoid of self-establishing nature. What could be more amazing, excellent manner of instruction than this statement? See, this guy's super, he's swooning over dependent origination in the Buddha. It's so cute. This real fact of dependent arising, which, if grasped at as establishing true existence, makes infantile beings' bondage to grasping for extremes more firm. Is the gateway for the learned to cut all the webs of their mental fabrications without any exception. Okay. Cut out all the sankhara. As the teaching is not seen in others when the title teacher is really yours alone. It's a sham word, however, if also used for those with heterodox views, like lion for the species fox. To call anyone else a teacher other than the Buddha, the triumphant, O guardian, to call anyone else as a teacher is just, it's like calling a fox a lion. How wondrous a teacher, how wondrous a safe direction, how wondrous a supreme speaker, how wondrous a guardian. I prostrate to you, that teacher who spoke excellently about Dependent Horizon. This guy's off his rocker. He's in another realm of, I like it a lot. It's very cute. Okay. Praise can be a practical part, praise can be a practical part of the aspects of practice in Bhuta Nusati. The heck is Nusati? I kind of like it. Buddha Nusati. Buddha mindfulness. Common Buddhist practice. Meditating on the virtues of Buddha. Oh, meditating on the virtues. Okay. Okay. That makes sense. I like it. Some words feel better than others. People tend to latch to words that make them feel good. True. Doesn't appear to correlate with any logic or evidence as far as I can tell. Just what feels good. All right, so feeling good is a fine thing to do, but it's not really a justification for truth. Just what feels good. People feel good. They're very concerned about what is good. Ooh. That's the way things appear to be to you, anyways. Interesting. All right, y'all. It's been fun, but I must depart. It is my time to get lunch. Oh, and also to ask the question for our dear friend Leigh Brasington. I'll be asking him in the comments. Just gotta formulate how I'm gonna ask the question because I'm not entirely sure about. I'll be back possibly on Monday, maybe another time. I'm not sure. You know, maybe we'll go through and read this whole In Praise of Dependent Arising because, man, it's so cute. To call anyone else a teacher. How silly. Okay. And look, what is emptiness? Well, maybe on Monday. I'm not sure. Like and subscribe. Okay, like and subscribe, everybody. Like and subscribe. I'll be back. And I have a bunch of old videos too. You can watch all the videos and you can see all my live streams. They're all there. I'll catch y'all on Monday. Hopefully you take good care of yourselves until then. Do some wholesome activity, maybe a little meditation, maybe be kind to people, maybe praise the teacher. Who knows? Do whatever you gotta do. I'll catch y'all next time. See ya.